Hey everybody, welcome back. We're doing another one. This time we're going to talk about the sort of late imperial period in both China and Japan. We're getting closer and closer to what's become people are starting to call it the early modern period. We're not quite there yet, but we're looking at the sort of ending of the classical world, or this sort of imperial model that people tend to think of when they think about the ancient past. We're approaching something new. So this time we're going to be looking from about 1000 to 1500, both in China and Japan. And they're going to sort of veer off into separate trajectories. We've seen earlier Japan borrowing a lot from China, but we saw that sort of getting near the end of the last period we were looking at, Japan is sort of starting to develop its own cultural traditions and steer away from China and see itself as separate as well. So this will be kind of interesting. There's a big chunk in the middle where you get outsiders that you may know about. They're causing big problems in East Asia. Not problems for them, problems for the Chinese and Japanese a little bit. The Mongols, so we'll talk about them as well. So we'll start by looking at late imperial China. We'll see the end of the Tang, look at the Song Dynasty. Then we'll talk about the Mongols, China coming under Mongol rule, East Asia really being subject to Mongol rule, and then veering away from that back into the early Ming. And then we'll look at what is often called warrior Japan, or this sort of timeline in Japan where the imperial family is sort of secondary in terms of government, and you get the rise of the samurai class and all these sorts of things that some of you might be familiar with. So let's just get right into it here. When the Tang Dynasty dissolves, you get another dynasty pretty quickly. Unlike previous, at the end of the Han, or these sorts of things where there was this big break. It's a couple hundred years, right? You don't see that this time. In less than 100 years, you're back to a sort of quote-unquote unified China and a sort of standard imperial tradition that we recognize. So we'll sort of see how that works, why there isn't this sort of period of chaos. We didn't talk a ton about why the Tang fell apart. The book does a pretty good job. Basically, we saw there were some rebellions internally. There was that sort of idea of imperial overreach. There was the Empress, right, who briefly took over and made the Zhou dynasty and all these other sorts of problems. But the Tang leadership themselves also espoused a sort of interesting nativism. Now we would call it kind of like a nationalism or something, where they were concerned about authentic Chineseness. And near the end of the Tang dynasty, this drove them to do things like persecute Christians that had really, really long been in one particular group of Christians, right, Nestorian Christians, who had long been in Central Asia and parts of China, or the Muslims who were newly in southern China and some of the trading ports coming from India, Southeast Asia, and eventually even Buddhists, right, as authentically, like not authentically Chinese or something. So the Tang was causing a lot of problems for themselves in that they saw the sort of Taoist tradition as the only authentic Chinese thing. So that was contributing to all of their problems. Anywho, in the early 900s, right, 10th century here, you start to see the Tang dynasty fall apart. There's internal pressures, there's external pressures. And you can see there is a short period that we call the 5 Dynasties period or 10 Kingdoms period, stuff like this, that's in between. So just like before, there's this sort of breakdown of who's in charge. And even though there's still the idea of a unified China for a little less than 70 years, it's not going to be there. During the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, one of the dynasties continues the empire tradition. They claim to have an emperor, mandate of heaven, all that sort of stuff. And a young boy is put on the throne. He's supposed to have a regent, bodyguards, all these sorts of things. But basically, he's a placeholder, right? This happens whenever there's problems in the imperial line, and the next emperor to the throne is sometimes 2 months old or a couple of years old or something. You can't have them actually running the empire, right? So you have a regent do it. But in the case of this one kingdom, that's not what happened. When this boy was put on the throne, the head of the palace guard, Zhao Kuanyin, decides that instead of protecting the young boy and sort of helping the regent and all these sorts of things, nah, he'll just take power instead. When he does this, he renames himself Emperor Taizi. So Emperor Taizi is proclaims emperor, mandate of heaven, but only for this one kingdom, right, amongst many, in that like brief sort of chaotic period, not a really stretched out period. So you can kind of see his dates there, right? So he's right in the middle of that period. But once he becomes Emperor Taizi, he has a plan, just like we've seen before with Sui Wendi and other people, to reinvigorate a massive imperial order. The only thing is now that idea that you can or you should have one unified China and that there is this sort of central tradition of Chineseness is much more common. It's much more popular in the imagination of the elites and the wealthy, so it's a little bit sort of easier to do. What gives Taizi the advantage is his state has a particularly large military, so he uses that to sort of run roughshod over the other dynasties that were trying to break away and establish their own beginnings from the Tang. When he starts to take them over, he declares a new dynastic era, the Song Dynasty. But he was not the only one. We're going to see that even though this sort of chaotic period is over and there's been a new Chinese dynasty proclaimed, there were other dynasties kind of nearby or that were kind of Chinese that really complicate the story. And this is sort of becoming a theme, right? There's not just one sort of dynastic pattern that we can memorize and just think about. There's actually a lot of overlapping elements to it. So here you have that brief period, right, where after the Tang falls apart, a bunch of states are scrambling for who's going to be in power. Is it going to be a bunch of little kingdoms? Is someone going to take over? Well, Emperor Taizi has the answer. He's going to take over. Right, here he is. I like this sort of Song Dynasty people have these great hats that have like a big Dao stick across the back, right? It's pretty cool looking. Anyway, here's your Song Dynasty. But you'll notice it's quite a bit smaller than we saw before. It's smaller than Han, it's smaller than the Tang Dynasty. So they've definitely lost some territory. And who did they lose that territory to? Well, they lost it to other people that are forming their own dynasties. If you look at this map, this sort of shows the Song in relationship to its neighbors. So the Song dynasty is no longer messing around too much in Vietnam, what we'd now call Vietnam, right? It's called the Dai Viet down there. But also you see things like the Tibetan kingdoms. They're not quite one big organized state yet. You're going to have to wait a little bit for that, but they're coming. They were the Tibetans were just forming a sort of imperial tradition of their own and one unified state. Everybody thinks of Tibet, they think of Buddhists and fun-loving, people and all these sorts of things. Actually, Tibet was a really strong military power that harassed the Tang Dynasty and was a big part of the Tang Dynasty's downfall. But to the north in particular, you'll notice two areas that definitely used to be part of China, definitely used to be part of this Tang China or even the Han Dynasty that aren't anymore. Directly to the north, you see the Liao Dynasty. These people are Khitans, that's like the sort of ethnic group, but the name of the dynasty is Liao. And then to the west of them there, you see the Xia Dynasty. So Xi is just west or western, and so they're the Western Xia. So these people are sometimes called Tanguts, which is again, sort of their ethnicity, not the name of the dynasty. But from the perspective of the Tang or Chinese, these people are Western Xia. But this is really tricky. The Tanguts, they're not really well studied, actually. They were kind of Chinese, they're kind of Central Asian, they come up with their own writing based on Chinese, they have all kinds of Chinese cultural traditions, but they're also a little bit more in the desert, right? They're not eating a lot of rice out there in the desert. They have a different sort of cultural makeup, but they're also, from like a European perspective or something, they seem pretty Chinese. The Chinese don't necessarily think of them that way, but remember the Chinese have been putting people out there for a while trying to assimilate, so it's really complex. The Liao we know more about, especially recently. There's been a lot of studies about them. They are really interesting because they're in many ways kind of in between Chinese and I guess we would go back to like Hu people. But as we're going to see, they start to sort of become more Chinese. And in a way, you could even just say they were Chinese and they were the Chinese dynasty. So it gets really kind of complex. We can look at them for a second, these Liao people. So here's like on a map, the Liao, just showing some of the territory, right? There's a huge expanse. These people were north of the Song Dynasty. It was part of the lands that had been considered part of Tang China. It wasn't necessarily totally up into Siberia and like all the where the Mongol people and stuff like that were, but it's getting there. We don't really know the sort of lineage of these folks. They were probably Shanbei people, and remember we've seen them before. That had adopted a lot of sort of Chinese characteristics already. They would have spoken some sort of Chinese, they would have used Chinese characters, they would have practiced Confucianism, stuff like this. And probably what had happened was they were under the rule of those Turkish people during the Sui and Tang dynasties. So they're sort of newly freed from those Turkish confederacies, particularly after the Tang falls apart. So here's a picture of this guy. We don't obviously have a picture of him. This is a much later painting, Aboji. So Aboji is a local notable. He's a military leader, and he begins to build up in this area that's sort of in between northern China and Mongolia and you know, eastern Siberia, this Chinese style state. This gets a little bit tricky because he gives himself an imperial name as well. He also calls himself Emperor Taizu. So at the same time that the Song dynasty forms and the guy takes the name Emperor Taizu, the Liao dynasty forms and the guy takes the name Emperor Taizu. So there's something going on there. It's a little interesting. The Liao dynasty develops a strong military, a strong Chinese style state, and engages in negotiations with the Song. They're not at war. There's sort of a peaceful diplomatic binding between the two states. But traditionally, you think of the sort of Chinese state as in power, making diplomatic agreements with the, you know, barbarian outsiders. But if you actually look at what the agreement was between the Song and the Liao, it appears that the Liao are seen as the authority, right? So the Liao the Song dynasty has to deliver 200,000 bolts of silk and 100,000 ounces of silver each year, right, to the Liao. So the Song dynasty pays a lot of money to the Liao to prevent them from attacking or invading, raiding, all these sorts of things. It would seem like, just from that little bit of information and from this treaty, that the Liao were sort of the more important or stronger regional power, which is interesting because they're not normally considered in the sort of dynastic period, because the dynastic eras follow the sort of Chinese state, right? And a lot of people wouldn't necessarily consider the Liao Chinese. But the problem is these Liao people are definitely ethnically a mix of Chinese and Hu people. They have developed a writing system that's based on Chinese. They practice Confucianism, they have Confucian temples, they practice Buddhism, they have Buddhist temples, their architectural styles look Chinese, they eat Chinese style food, all these sorts of things. So how do you differentiate them from the Chinese? It seems somewhat arbitrary. So here's a painting it's in a tomb from one of the early sort of Khitan areas. So you can see the way they're depicting themselves. They're definitely wearing Chinese clothes. I mean, they have like the heavy robes and the boots that we've seen before, but remember those were popular in southern China before anyway, right? Here's a zoom in on one section of it, right? So you can see the guy. They're definitely depicting themselves in a sort of Chinese way. And it's not just in tombs. Here's other artwork from the Liao Dynasty, right? So obviously horses were really important to them and horse culture, which we know any of the sort of, once you get into northern China, horses and horse culture become much more important. And the further north you go, right, it's the main form of transportation, but also a huge part of the way you get food and do work and engage in war and all that sort of stuff, right? So here's the writing system that develops under the Liao. It's not Chinese. Like when I look at it, I can see Chinese characters in it, but they're kind of smushed together in weird ways. There's extra strokes. It looks almost it's like, I don't know, strangely like phonetic or something, like they're adding things together to try to make sounds. I'm not exactly sure how it works. But it's a different writing system. It's not Chinese, but it certainly is from Chinese, right? It's incorporating some of that Chinese style. Here's a Liao Buddhist temple. So you can see it certainly looks Chinese. They're definitely borrowing Chinese architecture. These are not nomadic peoples, you know, from the steppe who are uncultured or something, right? I mean, they're Chinese in culture in many, many ways. Inside of that temple, this is a carved wooden Buddha. So you can see Liao sort of embracing Buddhism, Confucianism, all these things we think of as Chinese, making really, you know, learned, incredible, cool artwork. So they're not barbarians at all. It's a sort of alternative Chinese empire to the north, if you will. So it's running sort of in parallel to the Song. Usually when you see a textbook or something and it talks about the Chinese dynasties, it'll go from Tang to Song to Ming. In between there'll be a little caveat on the Yuan Dynasty. We'll get to them in a second. So they sort of tend to skip people like this. But it's weird because this is a giant dynasty, probably bigger and stronger than the Song, but it gets kind of left out of the Chinese story, which is weird because it probably shouldn't. So something is going to happen to the Liao dynasty that's going to set up a lot of things coming later in East Asia. So the Liao dynasty is an empire, right? And all empires have lots of minorities within them. That's the whole point, right? Because you take over your neighbors, that's how you expand. So one of the minorities within the Liao empire was the Jurchen. So these Jurchen people were probably originally from kind of right north of the Korean peninsula, where, like, if you were today to leave North Korea and go north into China. So these were considered to be forest people by the Khitans. They saw them as like weird outsiders that lived in the forest. But under the Liao Empire, these Jurchen people took their indigenous culture and also took on all of the Khitan culture, the Liao dynasty, right, which was that sort of alternative Chinese culture, and began to develop their own ideas about, I guess we would say, independence now, right? That's a little too revolutionary to project into the past, but started to rebel and broke away from the empire. So you had this new group of people, the Jurchen, who were part of the Liao Empire, who rebelled and broke away and were very powerful, and eventually were actually able to take over the Liao Empire. When they did, they proclaim a new empire, the Jin Dynasty. So here you can see them, the Jin Dynasty. You can still see those Tanguts, right? The Xia. You can still see those Tibetans. You can still see the Song, right? So you get a sense of like what's kind of going on around. You'll see the Mongols up there. That's not one particular thing. That just means that's where there are ethnic people that we would call Mongols. There's no Mongol Empire yet. So the Jin Dynasty is really interesting because it is by far the strongest military state in East Asia during this period. And it expands into northern China, and it forces that Song Dynasty even further south. So here you can see the Song Dynasty is actually a little bit diminished by comparison to earlier. So after 100 years or so, 120 years, the Song Dynasty is kind of smaller than it was because these people from the north who have their own Chinese-style state are pushing south. In fact, the Jin are going to be responsible for building Beijing, right? So just like the Song have their capital in Nanjing, the Jin are going to make their own capital, and they're going to name it Beijing, which just means northern capital, right? So they see themselves as like a split between the Chinese. But this is kind of funky. When they build Beijing, they start to build nice buildings like this there. It's a Chinese-style building for sure. It's a temple. These people are Chinese culturally in some ways, right? But only a couple generations ago, they had been seen as like barbarians within the sort of non-Chinese empire, right? So it's all getting really tricky. Here's how they depict themselves. So they definitely depict themselves with all the trappings of Chinese culture and Taoism and Buddhism and everything that's developed within the sort of East Asian context. They don't see themselves as outsiders or barbarians or anything like that. They see themselves as cultured, civilized, inheritors of Chineseness, the mandate of heaven, all that sort of stuff. Even though they're going to remain a minority within their own empire, right? A lot of the people within the Jin Empire are Mongolians, Turks, Koreans, Chinese, right? All kinds of other stuff. But they see themselves just as like the natural leaders of this new Chinese style empire in northern China. If this is bumming you out or it's too complicated, don't worry about it. The book does a pretty good job. It's just really tricky because we're just trying to get a handle on the fact that there's always kind of other stuff going on. There's never really one China in the same sense that people today kind of claim there was or claim there is. There's a lot of stuff going on. Who are these people today? Are they Chinese? That's really tricky, right? Were they Chinese then? Stuff like that. So, well, what made these guys so powerful and what made them able to expand all across northern China, even down into Korea a little bit? They had built upon what the Koreans were doing and developed an extremely heavy cavalry. In terms of world history, this is kind of weird. It's kind of a first. This is a painting of them depicted by the Chinese further south. Their horses were armored. They were armored. They're legendary for having extremely heavy military armaments for a sort of pre-modern time. Here's a model depicting some of these Jurchen warriors dressed as they might be for combat. You can tell like this is for horse combat, this is for cavalry fighting. You wouldn't want to just be walking around in this thing, but look at the way that horse is done up, right? In full chainmail, the person's in this really heavy armor. Also, you'll notice the guy has a really particular hairstyle. The Jurchen had really elaborate hairstyles, which we're going to see are important kind of in the future. We'll get a sense of why that matters. Here's another depiction of a Jurchen warrior, right? You can see this just tremendous armor, really heavy iron. Sort of a very different fighting style. When you have an infantry that's really, really heavily armored like this, things like arrows aren't necessarily as effective, right? All that sort of stuff. So militarily, incredibly strong, incredibly destructive. they were kind of able to just mess up anybody they came in contact with, frankly. So they're not necessarily as expansive as we've seen some of the other Chinese states, but certainly the most powerful at the time. Um, so it's really weird. Were these people Chinese? Are they part of the Chinese tradition? Yeah, probably, right? It's been weird that they've been left out for a lot of the time. If you pick up a textbook made in the 80s or something, they don't mention these people at all, really. If they're talking about Chinese dynasties and stuff, even though they founded Beijing and all this. Also, they practice all of the things that we would think of as Chinese, right? They're Confucian, they speak Chinese, they write in Chinese. The name of their dynasty, Jin, is the Chinese character, right, for gold. So they're very much Chinese through and through. So what about the southern Song? So the Song dynasty is often divided into two periods, just the Song dynasty and then the southern Song. In this map, it's labeled with a U. Don't worry about that. Sometimes it said Sung. There's different depictions of it. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so you'll see on this map that at first, that sort of darker orange state was more expansive, and the capital was at Kaifeng, right? Kaifeng. But when the Liao pressed them out, and then when the Qin Empire presses south, the Song dynasty contracts. You'll also notice from the west and from the sort of southwest they're contracting. Those are the Dai people, and the Tibetans are also kind of carving off little sections of Song China. So the southern Song dynasty, you can just call it the Song, it's fine. It's just to remember that about halfway through, so the Song dynasty, right, is around for 300 years. But about halfway through, it starts to just kind of constrict and constrict and constrict. And that's the story of the Song dynasty in some ways. We'll get to it. It's sort of a paradox. They build their new capital. Sometimes it's written Hangzhou. That's the way I put it here because it's the way it's on the map. It's also Hangzhou, right? So you'll see it that way written sometimes. I know one of you guys is really hyped to the city and is really excited to write about it. I think that's what you're doing for your final project and stuff, right? So the Southern Song is really interesting, and there's a general sort of paradox about them. In some ways, they're just incredibly successful, and they're one of the most successful Chinese dynasties. In other ways, they're continually getting beat up and kind of shrinking until they just fall apart. So unlike in previous dynasties that were shrinking or that we see falling apart, the Song had great leadership. They actually had a really strong dynastic system. They had a clear sort of Confucian ideology that they put to use. They had a meritocracy. The government made good choices. So they actually have a government that's working. They have leadership that's good. They have a huge navy that we'll get to kind of more in a second for shipping and commerce. That's really, really powerful, the most powerful in the world. So it's not like they're being destroyed militarily or that they have bad leaders that are making mistakes. In fact, it's the opposite. It's like they should have fallen apart really quickly, but because of these strong leaders and strong military and strong commerce, they stuck around a lot longer maybe than they would have. So as we'll see in a second, during the Song dynasty has the biggest economy in the world by far. They have incredible technological advancements. They have this really sophisticated culture with lots of sort of highbrow art. The average Song person has a really high standard of living, but they're always worried about being invaded by Dai people, Tibetan people, the Tanguts, the Mongolians, the Jurchen, the Jin. They're suffering from sort of constant sort of diminishing returns on empire, but at the same time they're super successful. And that's kind of a paradox, right? It kind of doesn't make sense so much. Normally, what we've seen is if a dynasty is really successful, then they do well territorially, and then they'll do really well for a couple hundred years. Here they're doing really well kind of the whole time. It's just like long term, it's not quite working. So what do we mean that they were doing really well? What is this sort of flourishing song that people talk about? Well, first, the empire was incredibly urbanized. So part of that shrinking effect forced people even more into cities. So in Song China, more people lived in cities than the whole rest of the world combined. That's an incredibly weird statement, right? I mean, just compared to anywhere else in the world, in the Americas or Africa or Europe, um, it was just really densely urbanized. So here's a painting from the Song Dynasty showing a city with its city wall and canals. So you can get a sense of the sort of grandeur of the architecture. Um, the sort of the street scene there, right, has tons of people on it and houses and fencing. Here's another depiction of a city in Song China. You see these in Song images, there's often these depictions of bridges, right? Because there was this new sort of bridge building technology that made for really cool, stable bridges. But you can see just like really densely packed sort of urban environments. Obviously, there's no skyscrapers or anything like that. That's not what I mean by urban. But you know, marketplaces and all kinds of varieties of shops, long exchange commerce made it so that these cities had access to products from all over Afro-Eurasia, which is just incredible at the time. Um, Here you go. Here's another depiction of a palace right on the water. So you can see just the incredible sort of architecture of the period and stuff like this. Also, the Song undergo. People have been looking at this more and more. A sort of commercial revolution. Do I have a good picture? Oh yeah, here's a nice bridge. So this is a picture of the bridge on Market Day, right? So anyway, there's a sort of commercial revolution that happens during the Song. And this is pretty surprising for a lot of people that are steeped in sort of Western economic thought, because the Song had things like banking, really elaborate systems of banking. They had credit. They had a sort of, you wouldn't say stock market, right? Because they don't have a centralized location. The Dutch kind of developed that, and with stuff coming out of the Arab world. But anyway, they do have futures contracts, though. So you can buy a piece of paper that says that you are basically betting what the price of rice will be next year, right, and stuff like that. So they're really elaborate sort of new economic instruments that are introduced during the Song that lead to a, I mean, we can't quite call it capitalism, right? Capitalism is a culturally invented idea, but it involves a lot of these aspects of capitalist systems, right? Which is interesting because a lot of people assume those develop in Europe, but it's not really true. Many develop in China, the rest develop in North Africa and the sort of Arab world, and then Europeans sort of pick up on them later. But during the Song, as you can see, it's just incredibly dense sort of markets. What do you need for that to happen? Well, you need people to have money, right? You can't be trading in kind for markets. You can't take your 80 pounds of rice to the market and trade it for everything. So you're using money. You also have to have commodities and exchange. One of the biggest commodities coming out of the Song was porcelain. So by this time, the Song are mass manufacturing porcelain. There's government monopolies, but there's also private business that are producing really incredible amounts of porcelain. They found shipwrecks that have 60, 70,000 pieces of porcelain on them that were headed for Indonesia or India or even the Red Sea. So the porcelain trade is bringing a ton of money to China, but also to individuals that are involved in production, in transportation, right? All these sorts of things. There's another example. You start to get this really elaborate sort of vaseware and drinking ware and stuff like this. It's really cool. Here you go, the earthen jug. So this style that's in the white and black is really popularized during this time as well. And you can see this is very different than pottery we've seen before. It's really highly ornate. It's really well made. And you actually find this in archaeological digs from Norway to Morocco to Zimbabwe to central India, right? You can find these things because they're being shipped all over Afro-Eurasia, which is really incredible, right? Here's a nice little delicate piece that's a lotus teapot. So here you go. I told you that the Song had highly militarized navy. This is a drawing of a naval vessel that has hardened wood and metal planking. So often the first metal planked ship is strangely attributed to Americans, with the old Ironside and stuff like that. But the Chinese had metal-sided ships. The Americans make the first sort of submarine. But anyway, so they did have these really elaborate ships that were armored, that were made for war. This ship has like a trebuchet on top, right? I mean, it's really incredible. Here you can see some of them in action, right? So here's two ships depicted like fighting each other to sort of show you a sense of the scale or how people would have been posted. These are really wide ships. They're, this one on the left is 3 stories tall. You could have a ton of infantrymen on these ships, right? So you can just like drive this thing into a beach basically and drop these people off. Pretty incredible. Also, you'll notice that front ship is spraying fire out of it. What's that about? Yeah, the Greeks had this too, although we don't really know what the Greeks had, right? The fires that Archimedes talked about and all that sort of stuff. But it's some sort of early version of napalm. We're not exactly sure what these things were because the sort of chemical recipes are lost to us and all. But we'll see that this is when the Chinese developed gunpowder. It had developed under the Tang, but during the Song Dynasty, they start to use it for all kinds of military applications, not just fireworks. Here, this was probably some sort of hydrochemical that they had burned and mixed. During the Song Dynasty, they're already pulling natural gas out of the ground to use for certain things. So it's unclear exactly what the sort of amphibious warfare fire was that they used, but they had it, which is also a really early sort of innovation, right? Well, not all the ships were used for war. A lot of the Song vessels and their sort of technology was used for shipping. If you're going to be making all that porcelain, you're going to be selling it all over the world, you need to be able to stack a ton of it in a boat and take it somewhere. So here is one of the Song vessels made in replica. This is an early form, particularly in southern China, of what we're later going to call junks, which is the sort of the word that develops. It's kind of Chinese, it's kind of English. It's the word that they use around Hong Kong, right, for the ships that are down there once the British start showing up. But it's an early form of these trading vessels that would carry a lot of porcelain and rice and other stuff like that. Here's another one showing the sort of complexity of the sails. So compared to European shipping technology, this is like light years ahead. And I'll show you, particularly during the Ming, there's a picture that's going to help you really get a sense of this. One of the reasons that the Song had such great naval advantages, particularly in shipping, was because of this little cutie. If you're looking at this and you're like, well, it's just a big spoon in a box, I don't know what this is. You do know what this is. It's just not quite the same way that we would set it up now. It's a compass, right? So it's a magnetic compass. Greeks and Romans and West Africans and Americans knew about magnetism already, right? That you could just take something metal and you could rub it on like animal skin and then it would have that sort of static cling. But the Chinese perfected a system where you could balance metal that had been magnetized and it would be able to pick up and point towards the north. So with a compass, you could tell what direction you were going much more accurately. This led to better maps, trade routes, knowledge of seasonal winds, currents, all that sort of stuff, because once you can have a compass, you can accurately chart and map those much more easily. So the Song benefited tremendously from the magnetic compass, which made its way really quickly to the Arab world and then eventually to Europeans. And then that's what's going to really help Europeans actually navigate outside of the Mediterranean, is the version of the magnetic compass they get from the Arab world, who gets it from China. Also, during this time, you see an absolute explosion of printing. There are still millions of pieces of paper from the Song dynasty that exist. They were printing the Buddhist sutras, they were printing those Confucian classics, they started printing novels. There's very famously, like, they liked these sort of detective romance novels that were very famous. Or some of you read the Song, like the Tong, like, collected stories that were sort of like fairy tales or magical tales, or like local histories that sometimes included magic and stuff. Those were really popular. People liked to read them. Here's that movable type, right, that Europeans often claim to have invented earlier in the Song dynasty, though. Here it is, right? So you have a Chinese character carved on the block. You move the blocks around so that you just have a whole script. Then you just print, then you can move the blocks around, print again, right? The problem is with a European language like, say, English, you only need 26 letters, right? And then maybe a block for a space, and then, you know, some punctuation and stuff. For Chinese, though, even by this point, you would have wanted hundreds of blocks to be able to print really basic stories. But then for complex work like sutras or the Confucian classics, you might have needed thousands of blocks. So it is less practical in some ways than it is for European texts that are alphabetical, lend themselves better to block printing, right? So here you go. There's an example of how the printing actually works once you line up the blocks and print it. You can fold it back, right, to see the sutra there. Here's some cash, right? So our word cash comes from Chinese. This is from the Northern Song dynasty. Basically, these were coins that had a hole in the middle, and you strung 100 of them together on a string, or 20 together on a string, right, or however many, so that you knew how much they were. And it was called cash, right? That was the name of the currency. So that's where we get the word, kind of cool. But during the Song dynasty, during this commercial revolution and much more printing, something strange happened. It was kind of a first in world history. Instead of carrying around these big, heavy bags of cash to be used and broken up, what if instead you just had one piece of paper that subbed in for cash? It was called flying cash because it was so much easier to carry and use. So the state printed authorized pieces of paper that stood in. So here's one of the earliest versions. So you can see actually printed on the paper is a picture of the coins, right? So when this was printed, they were like, this piece of paper equals this many coins. This is a real revolution, right? Being able to use paper money, flying cash, and it made market exchanges much quicker, much easier. The idea that you could have a piece of paper that equaled money is really incredible. So if any of you have any cash on you, take a look at it sometime and be like, what is this really worth? Well, it's really worthless, right? I mean, money is just a piece of paper. It's the idea behind the money that we all agree that it's worth something, that gives it any value, right? You can go into a store with this piece of paper, someone else agrees that it has value, and so it does. So that had to be happening here. People had to believe in the state, they had to believe in the banks, they had to believe in the market, they had to all together as a sort of society agree that this piece of paper represented wealth somewhere and could be exchanged. And that was just a huge sort of change from what we see elsewhere in the world. This is eventually going to be popularized, right, in the Islamic world and then in Europe as well. So pretty incredible stuff. Here's some more flying cash. Here's some Song dignitaries. eating really elaborate food and having tea. Tea was known in China quite early on, but it was never really, really popularized. One, the sort of tea you could drink was not that great. The legend is one of the first emperors, right, was boiling some water so that he could drink it. You used to have to boil your water, or if you're in Texas, apparently right now you have to boil your water, right? You used to have to boil your water in order so that it was bacteriologically okay to drink. So he's camped and he's boiling his water under a tree. Some of the dried leaves fall out of the tree and land in his water, but he doesn't care. He's a tough dude. So he drinks it anyway, and he notices it has a delicious flavor. So there, boom, tea was born, right? That's one of the myths about it. But really, it was a commodity that was exchanged on the Silk Road. It's unclear where it comes from. It might come from southern China. It might come from far eastern India, the sort of edge of Tibet there. But it's been consumed for a long time. During this period, though, it was refined into a much more easily drinkable and delicious beverage. Before you would dry the tea leaves all pressed together in a brick, and then you would sort of grind some off into some hot water, and it would be a little sludgy and not great. Now, with these sort of consumer networks, you can grow tea, you can pick it. There were new mechanisms for processing it, and you could get it to the marketplace quick enough to where you could enjoy it just in its leaf form. It was much more lovely. Here's a depiction showing some tea being made, right? And the workers at one of these events kind of cleaning up after everybody eating. Here it is kind of zoomed a little further out, right? So you can see this sort of elaborate tea culture. It went along with a whole sort of culture of excess. The Song built and continued to build on all of the Tang sort of elite culture, right? So you have all of those new poetic forms, music forms, dining experiences. They're going to continue into the Song. And you would, if you were an elite person, you might have a whole range of options of foods and teas that you would eat and drink, and you would listen to music, and it would be a big kind of scene. But it's not just for the elite. This is a painting depicting tea sellers on the street. So guys would walk around with like big barrels basically of hot tea and teacups, and you would just pull up, and for a little teeny bit of cash, they'd just hand you the cup full of tea. You drink it, you gave them the cup back, they rinsed it in one of the barrels, and then they were ready for their next customer. So it became a sort of popular beverage as well. It wasn't just for the elites for these fancy dining parties with music. You could be on the street, going somewhere, be like, you know what, I need a cup of tea to keep going with my day. Get a cup of tea on your way out, right? Another thing that really enabled the Song dynasty to flourish was simply just a lot more food. Remember, the more rice you have, the more people you have, but also rice was a commodity. So if you can grow more rice on the farm, you can sell it for more. Farmers can buy new and better farming equipment, newer and better houses, maybe educate some of their kids. Maybe those communities can have more money in them. So really this came from Vietnam, actually, this sort of revolution. So in what today is southern Vietnam was a kingdom called Champa. And it's really unclear who these people were. They have connections to Muslims from India. Anyway, they had developed a new strain of rice that could be grown and harvested again within the same season. So you could double crop. Also, the yield was better. So basically, your field, instead of just sowing it and raising the rice and then collecting it and being done for the year, you could get 2 harvests out of the same field. You might not get exactly double, but you might get basically double the amount of rice off the land. So here's some examples of different varieties of rice. If you're the average American, you probably don't eat a ton of different types of rice, but in Southeast Asia and South Asia and East Asia, there are tons of different types of rice. Every village might have their own sort of strain. So this was just one particular strain that came to China that happened to be really good at double cropping. It just really boosts the sort of amount of food in the system. You'll notice that all of these rices in the middle in this picture are white. That's not because they grow that way, right? That's because they've been polished or because they've had the hull ripped off of them. So down in the bottom of this picture and in the top, that's rice that's just in its more natural form. You can see some of it is more hulled than others, but basically rice is grown, it has like the bran on it. If you've ever had brown rice, that's the same as white rice. Just the brown rice hasn't been milled as much. And so if you take brown rice and you continue to mill it, the exterior bran and sort of germ layer will come off and you're left with white rice. So anyway, big nutrition gain from this stuff. Also, the Song just engaged in all kinds of trade with Japan and Southeast Asia, the Islamic world, which, by the way, was heavily focused around Indonesia and India, also around the Mediterranean, right? So I think now when people think of the Islamic world, they think of Southwest Asia and North Africa and stuff, but remember the most populous Muslim country is Indonesia, right? Stuff like that. So much wider, broader global exchange that saw the Song really, really flourishing. So one element in particular to the Song that we might look at is the exam system and a growing sense of what might be called Neo-Confucianism. Someone asked about this earlier in the discussions because it came up. Basically, there is a difference, but it's a little bit subtle. I'll try to explain some of it in the end here. But under the Song, like I was saying, the government was pretty solid and made a lot of good choices and actually had some fairly decent leadership that kept them from going under at times. And part of that revolves around the Confucian exam. It absolutely blooms under the Song. It gets bigger and bigger. The tests are open to pretty much any man in any of the counties. If you grew up in the most rural area and you happen to know the classics or whatever, somehow you can find a way to get the exam at some nearby village or provincial headquarters or a Confucian temple. So it becomes a big staple of the culture. During the height of the Confucian exam system during the Song, you had maybe 1 or 2% of all men had this lower degree. Right? Remember, there were the two different degrees, one that was really, really hard to get and required tons of knowledge, and one that was the sort of lesser degree that required you study for a few years the classics and Confucian texts and sort of prepped you for basic governmental service. So this, 1 or 2% of society having this degree for the men definitely put a big priority on book learning. And the way the whole system was set up, right, was that you studied texts. You studied the Confucian classics, you studied the books Confucius talked about, you studied people writing about Confucius, you studied books of poetry that were designed to demonstrate perfect examples of that poetic form, all these sorts of things. But what you didn't really do was education. You weren't really trying to find new scientific truth that wasn't scientific. You weren't trying to develop new technological creations. That's not what it was about. It was about this sort of introspective understanding of Confucian morality and ethics and philosophy that would then lead you to be the best leader or government official or person overall that you could be. And it's not to say that scientific and technological advancements didn't happen. Of course they did. We just saw that a second ago. There were tons during the Song. It's just that those weren't seen as part of the intellectual, academic, elite class. It would have been merchants who did that, farmers who did that. It would have been out of necessity to come up with some new technology, right? It would have helped you in the field. Whereas to be a learned, cultured gentleman, you studied the Confucian texts. So everyone's taking these exams. It leads to some funny things. When you have hundreds of thousands of people taking the exams every year, and the exams are getting more and more complicated, people cheat. So this is a little mini book designed to help you cheat on the Confucian exams. So when you took the exams, you would basically be put in a booth. You would be administered the test, and then you would just like write on this thing for hours and hours, sometimes days, depending on the exam you were sitting for. So a lot of it was based on memorization. So how do you memorize things? Well, you might write them down in miniature. Here's another book, right, that a wannabe scholar might sneak into his Confucian exams, and he would use this to help him. You could study off it, but also it was made to help you cheat, right? So pretty sweet. And if you succeeded, you joined part of a new class. There was something developing, this sort of Mandarin class. So because there were so many scholars who had taken the test, they studied, there's a sort of new social genre of people who are just studying for the exams, people who passed the exams, people who don't necessarily have cush government jobs or anything, but did take the exams to show that they're educated, and it gets you into a sort of elite status, even if you aren't part of the aristocracy, you're part of the imperial family, or you know your family's not from an important lineage or rich, you're part of the general sort of upper military crust or something like that. You could still be part of this elite educated class by taking these tests, and they start to develop their own culture and way of thinking and place of existing within society. And we're going to see more and more of these sort of mandarins. But you also get people like this. This is a failed scholar. So if tons and tons of people are taking these exams, you can be more choosy. The exams get harder. There's lots of people who take them and fail. There's lots of people who take them 2, 3, 4, 5 times because you can just keep taking them and they fail. But meanwhile, these people are learning to read and write. They're learning lots of poetic techniques. So sometimes people will fail the exam 3 or 4 times, and instead they become a poet or an artist and they write about failing the exams, right? So there's this sweet class they're trying to get into, and it doesn't work. They're kind of always stuck in this sort of failed position. So I guess you just sit by the river and drink wine and write about how you're a failed scholar. I guess that's not too bad either, you know? But for those who succeeded, especially with the upper degree, and soon there were different types. There were all kinds of different aspects of the Confucian exam you could take to show you were more skilled in one area. It really did create a life of privilege and sometimes prestige for people that took the exam. If you were from a small village and you passed the exam and you went home, you would have been seen as separate from the other peasants, separate from your family, even if they hadn't passed the exams, in that you were just sort of more worthy and better, frankly. And you could have sort of parlayed this into a cool job back at your home, although often, if you wanted to work for the government, you would be sent somewhere further away. You might be sent to a different province or something like that to be a judge or a governor or all manner of bureaucrat. So it really did create this sort of new section of society, particularly during the Song, with more and more people taking it and the class sort of hardening into its own thing. Yeah, we'll see a lot more of this. Here you go. Here's some scholars sitting around thinking, right, pondering the classics, right? So Neo-Confucianism sort of arises during this time. People start to talk about Confucianism in a slightly different way, and then scholars now, of course, reflect back and say, Confucianism was changing. What was happening here? Well, you might point towards people like Zhi here. Um, he was a Confucian scholar who had some different takes. She was arguing for broader understandings of the universe and cosmology. So by this point, by 1100, right, Taoism and Confucianism are overlapping a little bit. Buddhism's been introduced. There was a whole new language put into place around Buddhism that built on Confucianism and Taoism. And some of the ideas kind of mingle and merge a little bit, and people become used to the idea of, say, an afterlife or a broader definition of sort of heavenly powers or cosmic forces or what happens after you die or ancestor worship, right? All of these things that come from Buddhism or from interaction with different religious texts and stuff like this. So Confucianism is compelled to address some of these issues. And what she does is he sort of starts to talk about this new cosmology within the context of existing ideas in China. So ideas from the Tao, ideas from more native Buddhism, and in particular he focuses on qi. And he argues that qi, which is like the cosmic energy, the energy that flows through everything, the energy inside individuals, right? If you've heard of like Tai Chi or something, this is the same Chi, is shaped by Li. So if you think back and remember back to Li, or if you've been reading the Confucian book, right, like we're supposed to be doing, Li is like an alternative to law, right, in the Confucian ideal. Li is the rituals, the rites. So basically, by following the rites, by following ritual, by following these sorts of daily practice, you are shaping not only the energy inside of you, but sort of in the cosmic world. So the reason to do the rites is not just because they generate good things, in the world around you and within you, but it's because when these rites are done, they actually shape the sort of cosmic energy around. So this is not something Confucius would have been familiar with. He didn't write like this, but it's a way for Confucian thinkers to address new ideas from Buddhism, from more popularization of the Tao, even responding to Islamic ideas and Christian ideas coming in. It's a way of sort of building more of what we might call a religion, because Confucianism in some ways isn't necessarily a religion. So it's kind of funky. And so I tried to find some nice charts on this. The only one I could find was in Spanish. But what this chart is showing, it's like Chinese and Spanish, is basically the idea of like yin and yang, right? Which was sort of part of indigenous Chinese thought. Sometimes it's associated with the Tao, right? Was developed into Confucianism, or the idea of the sort of five principal elements, fire, water, metal, was incorporated into the Confucian ideas. So there was a sort of growing mystic component to Confucianism. It wasn't just academic study, it wasn't just about the Confucian classics. It was tied into broader questions about reality and the universe around you and your role in the universe, and these sort of metaphysical questions that Confucius himself didn't really address because he wasn't that concerned with. But now people in China are concerned with these issues, so Confucianism, the sort of religion or institution, has to deal with these issues, right? So they start talking about them. And in talking about them, they're creating something slightly different that scholars and people now refer to as Neo-Confucianism, right? Okay, so now that we've got a handle on the Song and these other dynasties like the Liao and the Jin, let's get to the Mongols. They're going to interrupt this whole thing and do something new, cause something new to go on, basically in Afro-Eurasia in general. And then we'll see it's kind of short-lived, and then we'll get back to Chinese history. uh, and this is often the way it's sort of thought of, which is strange because obviously the Mongols are a big part of Chinese history. They're not somehow separate from it. But anyway, let's take a look at that. So remember, we have these nomadic groups that are living sort of on the fringe of Chinese society. Sometimes they're the Hu people, or it doesn't matter. As long as you understand that there are people in the north that are horse riding peoples that don't necessarily practice agriculture, that are kind of on the move, and that sort of change out all the time. We've seen some people that were Turkish, some that were like the Xianbei that become Chinese, some that were, the Xiongnu Confederate, right? All these sorts of different things. It's not one group, right? They switch out. But we can talk about some of the characteristics, the shared characteristics of these groups. So primarily, they lived off of their livestock. So these are pastoral people, they're nomadic, they're herders, they have horses, they have sheep, right? Goats. They don't really do cattle, right? That's not a thing yet, but they'll get to that. Anyway, so they're living off of livestock. And that's not to mean that they don't eat vegetables or that they don't engage in commerce or anything like that. One of the things that they are constantly doing is interacting with settled communities. So they raise horses, they raise livestock. That gives them a lot of commodities to trade with farming communities. So farming communities want horses. They want mutton, they want wool, right? They want skins to make clothing with, right? So there's always this sort of exchange between these nomadic, unsettled people and agricultural societies. Also, they want weapons, they want iron, they want, finished products, fancy boots, clothing, silk. They have to get those from settled farming communities and villages. So they interact. It's not like they're separate from each other, right? They're sort of close to each other in some ways. They're always interacting. So even though they're nomadic, they're relying on agriculture in a sense because they interact so frequently with agricultural society and settled society. So by about 1,000, which is when we're going to start sort of looking at them, all of these people in Central Asia and Siberia had absorbed lots of stuff from Europeans, from the sort of Turkish world, from South Asia, from China. Basically anything that worked, they would take in. And this was technologically, culturally, all this sort of stuff. As long as it was mobile, as long as it fit with what they were doing. But they continued to inhabit the sort of outside marginal environments, the deserts, the steep mountains, the sort of western steppe, the eastern steppe, right? Places where crops didn't really grow. This was where these nomadic people would tend to thrive. They might not be able to grow a lot of crops, but there's still plenty of vegetative matter to raise sheep on, as you go through and stuff like this. So there were societies that were developing, they were constantly changing. These are not like people that are somehow stuck in the past or something like that. And they're reacting to the changes around them all the time. Here's some of the environments they might inhabit. So, right, you look at this and you're like, oh, I don't want to live there and farm, and there's no protection and stuff like this. But this is perfect for nomadic folks, right? Because you can still raise your horses here as you go through. There's some of those nice horses you might raise, right? Of course, these are modern horses, modern pictures, right? So this is today is like Mongolia, Central Asia, this sort of landscape that would have been not suitable necessarily to settled agriculture, were great for nomadic peoples. So what was nomadic society like? Well, it was organized. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't just a bunch of people on horses that lived together. There were rules. But society was also much more fluid and mobile in nomadic worlds than it was in settled worlds. In the village or in the city, society had much more clearly defined hierarchies that were based around class and gender, ethnicity, stuff like this. In nomadic society, that doesn't make sense. You can't do that. Just like individuals are very mobile over the sort of geographic, domain, they were mobile within sort of class and social structure as well. So individuals and their families might be commoners and become nobles, or they might be from a noble family but become commoners. Status was constantly sort of renegotiated. It wasn't fixed, right? It wasn't as fixed. And you often had sort of smaller clans led by a particular chief or leader or big man, and then several of them might form a particular people or a particular ethnic group. But the problem was these groups were never heterogeneous, or they were never homogeneous in the same sense that we think of settled people. So what that means is if you're part of a nomadic society and you're cruising along through Central Asia and you come across a couple random people, they can become part of your tribe. Or if you attack another group and most of them are killed, but there's 3 or 4 people left, they can become part of your tribe. And tribe is kind of a funny word. It has a whole history of sort of European colonialism or whatever, but it makes sense in this context. You can use clan if you prefer. Anywho, so you might have a group of 40 or 50 people that all live together that speak 3 or 4 different languages, that are all married in sort of complex ways. It was really mixed up. It wasn't super fixed like we think of more settled groups. These groups tended to be patriarchal and, might was right kind of thing. But there were also lots of really powerful women. So when you think of, when we get to like Genghis Khan and stuff like that, he's surrounded by powerful women. His wife and his mom actually are big reasons for the success of the Mongols and stuff like this. So women often played sort of oversized roles behind the scenes or were adjacent to the leaders in ways that put them in authoritative positions. Also, nomadic folks would adopt any kind of technology or culture or idea from settled people that made their lives easier. If it worked, they used it. So new types of horse tackle or new weapons or new clothing that they liked, or all these sorts of things, right, could become part of nomadic society. The main weapon for these people was the bow and arrow and their ability to outrun their opponents. So because these horse riding people spent so much time in the saddle, so much time herding animals, so much time on the move, long distances, they were legendary for being quicker and faster and more maneuverable than the people they fought against. And that really gave them an advantage. If a settled community is there, it can defend itself from nomads, for example, from these pastoral people. But these people could attack from all kinds of different angles. They could do it very quickly. They could retreat just as quickly. And that really made them hard to fight. How do you track them back home after you defend your village if they don't have one, right? They just went somewhere else and wait for you to come out or something. It's hard to fight them. So here's a depiction of some of these people, Turkish people, right? You'll notice this guy's riding a camel. Yeah, sometimes they rode camels, horses, right? All kinds of stuff. And they by this point, know about Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, all the sort of Hindic religions, um, and some practice these religions, but most don't. Most would have practiced some sort of shamanistic religion, with the only real sort of key commonality to all of these different shamanistic religions was, in general, there was the belief in some sort of sky deity. And there is a connection that scholars have made between this and the early Chinese societies and their sort of concept of heaven. So a lot of the shamans wear this sort of blue ribbon or something that symbolizes the sky. And but there were lots of different indigenous, I guess we would say, that's kind of a tricky word. Each different clan or each different area had different religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs that would kind of lump together as shamanism, because they're not quite religious. They don't have that big institution or something like that. There weren't necessarily texts that say how these things are done, right? That's passed down tradition, oral tradition, things like that. But very malleable, right? So in the 13th century, something's going to happen. There's a particular charismatic leader of one of these nomadic groups, the Mongolians, that's going to essentially unite all of these different, totally disparate peoples into one like mega clan that we're going to call the Mongols. I know that's really kind of weird, because if you have an idea that like the Mongols are a people, that's just not it. But anyway, all these sort of separate groups are going to bind together into one incredibly large sort of confederated empire that's going to sweep across Eurasia. And here I'll show you a little Russian-made movie trailer for it. If you've seen the movie Mongol, it's really fantastic. Basically, the Mongols didn't make a lot of their own written texts, but they did make one. And the title is often translated as The Secret History of the Mongols. And it's one of the only genuine, authoritative, primary source documents from early Mongolian history. And anyway, there was a movie made based upon it. It basically shows Genghis Khan's early life and how he rose to power. It's their sort of mythology about that. And a movie was made about it called Mongol. It's pretty good. Here's the Russian trailer for you.
When he was a boy, everything he loved was taken from him. When he became a man, he would fulfill his destiny. He would raise an army, and he would take it all back. One day, he would rule the largest empire the world has ever known. Picture House presents a Sergei Bodrov film. To some, he was a brutal leader. To others, he was a god. Mongol, the untold story of Genghis Khan's rise to power.
Anyway, if you get a chance to see that movie, it's fantastic. It's made by a Russian director. It's made in these parts of Siberia that are now part of Russia, where the Mongols really do come from, and it really highlights all of the different sort of geographies and ethnicities and stuff going on that Genghis Khan is able to pull together. So here he is. We don't normally say Genghis Khan in the academic world so much anymore. Normally they'll say Chinggis because that was his actual name. Genghis Khan is like a weird European alliteration for it that they tried to put together. But anyway, Chinggis is how you would pronounce it normally. This is an actual painting of him, somewhat contemporary to his life. So maybe what he looked like, at least when he was older. So you can see his dates there, 1162 to 1227. The 1162 is a little bit approximate, but whatever, basically. So he was the son of a regional chief. His father gets killed, and then him and his mom and some of his other family members sort of struggle. They're reduced within this other tribe, but eventually make their way kind of back up. That's what the secret history of the Mongols is about and what that movie is about. And eventually Genghis Khan rises to power at first to sort of punish the people who hurt his family, and then to sort of conquer this wider nomadic world. That was the primary goal. After that is only when he starts to mess with with other places and comes into contact with China and Europe and stuff like that. So after a really long period of infighting, he eventually rules over all of these different clans and ethnicities and really complex groups stretching all the way, from Europe to Japan, basically. It's the biggest empire, the biggest land-based empire the world's ever seen. And he rules through these massively destructive campaigns, attacking basically anyone that gets in the way. They hinted to this in the in the movie, like Tasami was sort of a brutal ruler. They had all kinds of punishment for people who disobeyed and stuff like this. But at the same time, interestingly, he really promoted writing and religious tolerance. So Genghis Khan, as it turned out, although he's depicted as like this barbarian that sacks cities and all this sort of stuff, really appreciated writing and promoted all kinds of different sort of religious groups within his broader empire. And that has a really important impact because in the end, it's all of his descendants that are going to inherit different pieces of his empire, and they're all going to adopt different religions. So here he is, Genghis Khan depicted in an Arab sort of version of himself, right? Or sort of Turkish version of himself. Here's Genghis Khan depicted again from this sort of Southwest Asia, like Baghdad area, how he would look. I'll show you some more of these in a second. It's sort of funny how Mongols are represented. But so Mongols used that speed and advanced military technology that they had been working on, which I know might sound kind of funny. You're like, well, these are non-settled people. What do you mean by advanced military technology? They had a really, really well-developed recumbent bow, and sort of, so if you think about like Robin Hood, or if you think about like bows and arrows or something, and you just think it's like one stick bent with like a string, that's not it. These sort of composite bows were made from wood, they were made from horn, and then they were shaped this way, and then we bent back the other way. So you could have some of these Mongolian bows had like 80 pounds of pull, 100 pounds of pull on them. Really, really strong bow and arrow. Not it's not like an old technology or something. It's continuously evolving. Also, the Mongols had evolved and developed new types of spurs and new types of saddles that allowed them to be much more mobile, to fire backwards while riding, all this sort of stuff. So they had a lot of innovation as well. And their main tactic was a sort of hit and run style. So here you can see some of their many campaigns that they would go on. That hit and run style was really sort of complex, and it became very famous actually later on. They would charge into towards an infantry, and right around the time they got into range of the infantry, they would retreat, or they would fake a retreat. The infantry would then follow them, or even the mounted resistance, that the cavalry of that place would follow them. But what they didn't know was the Mongols could shoot backwards. So even as it looks like they're running from you, they would just turn around and fire arrows. So now you're running right into their arrows. So that was one sort of tactic they used. Anyway, so while Genghis Khan was alive, he was all over the place, man. So the Mongols are going into Korea, they're going into China, Central Asia, into the edge of Tibet. They take over those Tanguts, right? That's one of the first people they take over. They attack that Jin dynasty. They're into the sort of Black Sea area. It's crazy, right? They're really expanding. They get into today what's like Georgia and Hungary and stuff like this. Really, really expansive. And you can see this is all just within his lifetime, right? So uniting all these different tribes, uniting all these people, and engaging in battles all the way across Eurasia is complex and tiring, and he wasn't actually really at home very much. So even though on this map there's like a star there at Dulun, which is kind of like this mythical Muslim or mythical Mongolian homeland, it wasn't really, we don't really know where it was or what it was about. Like the sort of Mongol home city, we don't have it. We don't know where it is. Theoretically, they had one. It's maybe near Karakorum there. There was a sort of Mongol capital, but we don't know. Archaeologically, we haven't found it. We know because people write about it and being taken there and stuff like that. Anyway, so this huge land-based empire that stretches all the way across, Eurasia. You guys are familiar with this probably from the world history context. But when Genghis Khan dies, the empire immediately gets split up. So it's not an empire that's sort of built to last. It's very much on the horse at the end of a sword. There was no particular plan to rule over it, no direct line of succession. So when Genghis Khan dies, the empire gets broken up basically amongst his sons and grandsons. They compete for territory. And so Khan just means like king, right? It's like a Central Asian word for ruler. So when they get broken up into different kingdoms. But instead of kings, they have khans. So historians call them khanates. So the Great Khanate includes China and the Mongolian sort of homeworld. The Golden Horde was one particular group of soldiers that takes over a big chunk of stuff that's up there near Russia, like modern day Kiev and Moscow and those sorts of areas. The Chagatai is some Central Asia into Tibet a little bit. And the Ilkhanate is like Persia, Iraq, Iran, sections of Afghanistan, part of the Turkey, right, this sort of area. So all of these are really disparate. These places have totally different histories. They're European, they're Southwest Asian. The Ilkhanate, most of the people that were there were Muslim. The Chagatai, a lot of people that were there were Buddhist or Muslim. The Golden Horde is like on one edge is Christians and the other edge is mostly plains where these sort of nomadic people were anyway. The Great Khanate, right, is Chinese. And so very separate, like all these different sort of cultural spheres. And the Mongols were really good at adapting and adopting new cultures, new ethnicities, because remember, their society had been so fluid anyway. So in each of these places, you get sort of different representations of Mongols that fit those local customs. So for example, the leader of the Ilkhanate becomes Muslim and runs a sort of Muslim state. In the same way, the leader of the Great Khanate is going to sort of become Chinese. The Great Khanate, the grandson of Genghis Khan, is Kublai Kai. And Kublai Kai is going to turn the Great Khanate into a Chinese dynasty, right? So just like the rulers other places are going to kind of adopt a local culture, he's going to do the same. So there's the Yuan Dynasty. The capital is at Beijing. So remember, this is where the Jin had their capital, right? So they're still kind of closer to the north. Kublai Khan is a Mongol, but he's going to start to depict himself as Chinese, as a Chinese ruler over China. So here he is as a Mongol, right? Here he is depicting himself as Chinese. So why would you do this? Well, it makes it so that if you're going to rule over people, if they think you're like them, that's really helpful, right? And all that sort of stuff. But he's also lived in this area. He's steeped in Chinese culture. He believes that the Mongols have the mandate of heaven, right? This sort of Chinese ideas that he's adopting. But there's twists. Oh yeah, this is a European depiction of Kublai Khan. So if you check out like Marco Polo, right? Marco Polo meets Kublai Khan. That's who he's talking about when he goes to China. When Marco Polo goes to China, the Khanate is there. It's the Yuan Dynasty. And when he comes back to Europe, this is the European depiction of the people he meets. So they had never seen the Mongol, obviously, right? And they're sort of depicting this sort of Eastern leader as if he were European. There's a big history of that anyway. Anywho, the Mongols are super friendly to trade. And the Mongol Empire, although it's derived from the sort of horse riding warfare and expansionism, thrives on trade. So the Yuan Dynasty has these huge trade connections through the former Mongol Empire, all the other Khanates, and actually this is when the Silk Road is totally thriving again. So under the Song Dynasty, there was international trade and trade across Eurasia. But under the Mongols, actually, you get this thing that historians often refer to as the Pax Mongolia, which is a play on the Pax Romana, right? Or like the Roman peace. This is the Mongol peace. So even though the Mongols like brutally crush their enemies and attack these cities and all this sort of stuff, once they have this territory, they want it to be productive. They do it for the trade. So once they have all these areas, they keep them safe. You could get on a horse and go from Beijing all the way to Europe and not really worry about bandits or being attacked. You might get taxed or have to pay a fee, but it was relatively safe. This enabled Marco Polo. It also enabled this guy, Ibn Battuta, who, again, if you've done world history classes, he's another famous sort of character in world history like Marco Polo. He was a Muslim scholar who decided to travel and see the world. And so he went to North Africa, he went to East Africa, he went to India, he goes to southern China. And it's all part of this sort of Dar al-Islam sort of connection through the Muslim world, but in East Asia in particular, it's all enabled by the Mongol peace. Also, this era sees continued trade in the south, right? So here, remember the Song had that big navy and they were trading with Southeast Asia and Japan and India. The Mongols keep doing that. So when they take over China, they don't want to put a stop to any of this stuff. This is how you make your money, right? This is how you run a successful giant empire. If it's making money, people tend to like it. Yeah, there you go. These are, there's a really famous sort of world map made in Europe around this time, and this is a depiction of Mongols traveling along the Silk Road with that Pax Mongolia, right? These are Mongol guards guarding a trade mission. So it was a really easy time to sort of get around, actually, which is funny. It's counterintuitive. You might think about the sort of Mongol times or Mongol leadership as like brutal and violent, but actually pretty peaceful. So here you go. Here's the Yuan Dynasty showing this little section of Tibet that gets tied to the Yuan Dynasty. So by this point, the Chinese government system is extremely bureaucratic. All those Confucian scholars, there's all kinds of different bureaus within the government. And one of the bureaus is the Bureau of Buddhist and Tibetan Affairs. And this is set up by the Yuan Dynasty to manage this chunk of territory that they capture that's in Tibet. And as it turns out, this is when Tibetan Buddhism starts to enter China in an interesting way. The Mongols that are part of the Yuan Dynasty are hip to all of this new Chinese stuff. They're, eating it with a spoon. And one of the things they come across is this sort of form of Buddhism in Tibet, this Vajrayana Buddhism that really appeals to them. So the Yuan Dynasty is going to incorporate this almost as a state religion. They're going to build a massive Tibetan Buddhist temple in Beijing, and there's this sort of interchange between these newly conquered Tibetan people and their religion and the newly conquering Mongols and their religion. And a lot of Mongols in the Yuan Dynasty become Buddhists, but not any type of Buddhists from that sort of Tibetan genre, right? So there's a depiction of a Tibetan painting mandala, right? So this sort of version of Buddhism that's inherent to Tibet starts to filter into China, starts to filter back into Mongolia, and is popular with, at first, a certain type of elite that was also sort of outside to China, but it's becoming sort of indigenously Chinese, right? There's an interesting connection going on. Here's another depiction from Tibetan Buddhism, right, that shows a Maitreya Buddha. Okay, so these Mongols, though, are going to stay Mongolian, but they want to be part of Chinese society. So they do interesting things, like they set up parks within Beijing for horse riding, so they can still engage in those sorts of activities. They don't become fully Chinese, the sort of leaders of China. Even though they're embracing Chinese culture, they use Chinese names, they learn Chinese, they write in Chinese. They're theoretically the heads of the Confucian system. They're embracing Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism. But they're still sort of racially see themselves as different, or ethnically see themselves as different, and create a hierarchy where they're sort of better than the Han people. But as we know, the whole idea of being Han was kind of made up anyway. At one point, it meant a specific group, but at another point, it just means kind of all people under the empire. It's kind of tricky. Also, the Mongols are going to do something crazy as part of the Yuan Dynasty, or it turns out to be crazy. It wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but it turns out bad. They're going to kind of try to keep pushing east. The Mongols do take over Korea. That Goryeo kingdom eventually gets crushed by the Mongols for a while. But the Mongols try to keep pushing. They want to go to Japan. They've heard there's another country, another culture over there to take over, another place to push. It doesn't work out for them. When I talk about Japan, I'll talk more specifically about why it doesn't work out for them. But it's something to keep in mind. They get to Korea, they get to Eastern China, they don't get to Japan, and we'll sort of find out why when we look at Japan. I don't know why I had the weird swipe in there, but don't worry about it. So the Yuan dynasty is not tremendously long lasting. After Kublai Khan died, there was no clear path to succession. The Mongols didn't do a primogenitor system. They didn't just pass the empire to their firstborn male son or anything like that. Traditionally, what happened when a Khan died was all of the leading tribes sent a strong family member back to the capital or back to a main area, and there was a sort of power struggle. There was a competition for who was going to be the next leader. It was merit-based. It wasn't hereditary. So the Mongols hadn't changed this everywhere. In some places like the Ilkhanate, it changes but anyway, in the Yuan, it hadn't. So Kublai Khan dies. It's not clear who the next emperor is going to be. It doesn't just go to his son. Mongols liked the sort of power struggle. It was more indicative of their culture and how they chose leaders. At the same time that was going on, a bunch of issues were coming up in the Yuan that made that power struggle more problematic. They tried to attack Japan twice. It didn't work. They tried to push into Vietnam. That didn't really work. They took a chunk of Tibet, and they liked Tibetan Buddhism and culture. They wanted to interact with it, but there was already a big Tibetan kingdom that didn't want any part of that. So they were sort of overexerted. They were pushing too far, too fast. In northern China, where there's lots of plains, horses are great, and the sort of Mongol speed was really helpful. In southern China and Vietnam, though, for example, where it's really mountainous and lots of rivers and tropical, horses weren't as effective. So when the Mongolian forces got too far from where they were comfortable, their battle tactics weren't nearly as good. Also, what really is going to hurt the Yuan is the plague. So basically, in southern China, people are eating all kinds of different things. The Mongols are invading southern China. They see this sort of local food culture they don't understand. They don't really know what to eat. Some Mongols, they're used to hunting. They're in sort of semi-tropical regions in the south, and they see these big sort of mammals that they want to eat. So they eat them. They hunt them and they eat them. But this leads to some big problems. Inside of these mammals is this bacteria, or this bacilli, that causes the plague. E. pestis, something, right? Yeah, anyway. So this bacteria lives inside of these guys. And when it's inside of mammals like this, they're more of a reservoir. They developed with this bacteria, and it doesn't tend to kill them. But there's a problem. When this bacteria is introduced into human populations didn't have a resistance to it, and the sort of pathway of disease changed quite a bit. So how does the disease translate? You may know this from studying the plague when you looked at it in other world history classes or European history classes. Basically, on these mammals are fleas. If the mammals get sick with this bacteria that causes the plague, a flea biting the mammal will suck up some of its blood, but it gets this bacteria too. The bacteria is bad for the fleas. It messes with their digestive system, and the fleas get blocked. So here's a real picture of a blocked flea that's blocked with the plague bacilli. So what happens is the next animal this flea tries to eat on, as the flea punctures the skin and goes to suck out some blood, because its digestive tract is all gummed up with this bacteria, some of that bacteria will leak back out into the blood of the thing it's feeding on. So if it's feeding on something that has this bacteria and is a carrier, no big deal. But if it's feeding on something else, that's a big problem. So these Mongols were from an area with lots of mammals. It doesn't look like it, right? If you just look at this photo of like current Mongolian, you're like, well, big expanses. I don't see like lots of monkeys or, stock animals too close together in this photo or something like that. But what there was rats. So these Mongols went to southern China. They killed these mammals that had this particular bacteria in them. There's fleas on them. The fleas bite the people and also bite the rats that are traveling with the sort of Mongol caravans. Those make it back up into the prairie. So when these Mongols start to go home, they're now carriers for this disease. The disease is going to become endemic to Central Asia because it's going to get into the population of these prairie dogs and different, marmots basically that live in Central Asia. And it doesn't always kill them. They're more carriers of it. But as the Mongols travel, they have fleas, the horses have fleas, they come into contact with these endemic sort of reservoirs of disease, and they start to spread the plague. There you go, there's nice little rodents in their den showing you where the reservoir is for this stuff. So here you can see a map of the spread of this. So these Mongols that were in southern China spread the disease up into China, up back into Central Asia, and over into Europe and the sort of Muslim world. And this is incredibly destructive, right? You know that a big chunk of European population dies. The European story you're probably familiar with, but the same thing happens in China. So the plague in China kills maybe a third of the population, right? Remember, China is incredibly urbanized. If the disease moves with rats and fleas, there's lots of those in cities. So the plague spreads really quickly in these urban Chinese environments. It starts to cause a lot of destruction. At the same time, there's a growing sort of millennial movement in China, a religious movement that the end of the world is coming. This is caused in part by these religious groups who see the Yuan Dynasty as fraudulent, who see the Mongols taking over as the end of like civilized Chinese society. So there's these sort of underground, they typically tend to be Buddhist movements that say this is sort of the ending of the world and we need to get everything together before that ends, or we need to resist the ending of the world that the Mongols are bringing about, or that this Maitreya Buddha, this like future Buddha is coming soon. So there's all of these sort of religious movements that are developing in China that are tied to native Chineseness, that are sort of opposed to Mongol rule. All this stuff's happening at the same time. So there's no clear leader of the Yuan dynasty. There's the plague, they're overexerted. There's new sort of internal problems where citizens and subjects of the dynasty are getting involved in these sort of anti-Mongolian movements and religious sort of ideas. It's bad news for the Yuan. So with all these problems going on for the Mongols and the Yuan dynasty, things started to fall apart pretty quickly. That millennial statement that, or sentiment that the world was falling apart, that China was ending, gave rise to a bunch of secret societies and new organizations that sought to get rid of the Mongols or reinstate some sort of authentically Chinese society. And this is really strange because remember, what it means to be authentically Chinese changes all the time and had changed quite a bit. So one of these societies that really looked to make a big change were the red turbans. These were groups of people who wore red, head wrappings, that's hence the name, who saw themselves as the true sort of inheritors of the Song and the Chinese tradition and the Confucian tradition, and wanted to get rid of the Mongols. that were bringing all this disaster to China. Because remember, maybe the mandate of heaven wasn't with them anymore if they had these sorts of military problems and disease and stuff. So they weren't the only society out there. The White Lotus Society, which the book talks about a little bit, was another group of people who had this idea that there was some sort of future Buddha that was about to be revealed, or some sort of spiritual. The White Lotus Society was more of a Taoist organization, but believed there was some sort of transition that was about to happen, right? And they needed to help make it happen to end the Mongol rule. The future Buddha we've already talked about a little bit, Maitreya Buddha. Basically, this was a version of Buddhism that had a end of days component, kind of like Christianity, where there would come a time when the worldly existence we have now would end, and there would be some sort of apocalypse, right? And that the people that were in this particular faith aligned with the Buddha would maybe go to that Western paradise or would be saved in some way. These sort of sentiments often come up amongst people who have problems with the government they're in or in parts of rebellions, right? Things like this. Anyway, back to those red turbans. They were militant. They were a sort of group of not only peasants, but some elites who were secretly sort of pulling the strings to organize armed resistance to the Yuan Dynasty. And one person in particular is going to come to lead them in a new direction. Zhu Yuanzhang. Here he is depicted much later as an emperor. Anyway, his path to becoming the emperor and founding the Ming Dynasty is pretty crazy. He was orphaned. He was adopted by a Buddhist monastery. So his heritage is unknown, probably not noble status in any kind of way. He grew up in the monastery, but the monastery was destroyed by Mongols. So as the Mongols started losing their grip on power, they would often try to hunt down these rebels from different societies. They tried to put a stop to these societies. Some of them were lodged in temples. Those temples would get destroyed. So Yuanzhang was in this Buddhist monastery. It gets destroyed by the Mongols. This radicalized him. He joined the Red Turbans to exact revenge and get back at the Mongols and get back to a pure China. He rose quickly through the ranks. He was a good soldier. And within a few years, he's leading bands of Red Turbans that capture Beijing. When he does, he's sort of the most notable and beloved of the group. He declares himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Ming. When he does that, he doesn't want the capital in Beijing anymore because that's where the Mongol capital had been. He moves it back south to Nanjing, which had been the capital before, right, for the Song. Well, it wasn't during the Song, but it was in previous dynasties, right, in the Tang. So when he does this, he takes a new name, Hongwu. So Hongwu is a little bit interesting. So here I have emperor at the end, right, but it would have been D. Taking this sort of imperial name, the Wu we've seen before, right? Anywho, so the Ming start based on a rebellion against the Yuan, and the platform of the rebellion is back to a sort of native Chinese-ness. There were a lot of Chinese who never really saw the Mongols as proper rulers, never believed they have the mandate of heaven, and always sort of resisted this rule that they saw as exterior. So all of that contributes to the ruling style of Hongwu as he began to put this empire together. So here's a picture of the Ming Dynasty a little bit later on. It's not this big at first, right? It expands. You notice those Tibetan tribes and kingdoms are a little bit bigger over there now. The Chagatai Khanate is still over there, so it hasn't dissolved. But the sort of greater Khan has gone away, right? There's no more Khanate over China. It's the Ming Dynasty. So Hongwu was despotic. He came to power through violence to expel foreigners. He was sort of paranoid that the system was rigged against him and that there were sort of outsiders trying to, all this sort of stuff. But at the same time, he was not a iron-fisted ruler. He imagined China in the past, right? In that same sort of conservative bend, that there was this greatness in previous dynasties where actually he thought there was a smaller sort of government with collective villages that all kind of managed their own in a sort of holistic version of what China could be. He also was skeptical of the sort of economy that the Mongols had been running that was based on extraction and other things like this, and long distance trade. He wanted to change the taxation system. He started taxing in kind again instead of in coin. So instead of using money for taxes, he goes back to taxing people in rice, basically. So if you're a peasant farmer, you get taxed a certain percent of your crop, right? Which is really different from what the Mongols had been doing and what the Tang had been doing as well. And he kept a large standing military. So if you come to power through military force and you're kind of paranoid about outsiders and your sort of whole platform was expelling these foreigners who had taken over, you can see why you might want a big standing army to ensure that it didn't happen again. But he also was trying to build a very cohesive unit of some kind. And one way you might do that, and what he tried to do, was he tried to restrict travel for regular people. So if you were born in, the Hangsi village, you stayed there. The idea was villagers should just live where they live. They should work where they work, die where they were born. Basically, that moving around for the peasants could only really lead to problems and rebellions and all this other stuff that he had been a part of during the Yuan. So he sought to sort of tie peasants to the land a little bit more, and this is going to create a whole sort of system coming down the line. We'll see that gets changed a little bit in the next dynasty. As part of expelling the Mongolians, as you can imagine, and sort of finishing off the Yuan and pushing back the Ming Dynasty to this larger size that's actually bigger than the Song had been, the Ming had to engage in a lot of foreign wars. During the dynasty, 308 recorded wars, which wouldn't have been like on the scale of a massive war or anything. A lot of these would have been campaigns, right, instead. During the dynasty, which is incredibly high. That's, several a year in many cases, mostly against the Mongols and the northern frontiers, but also against the Tibetans, the Viet peoples, Korean peoples, kind of all over the place. As part of this effort, once he had pushed a great deal of the Mongol forces north, he set about rebuilding the Great Wall. And I have one of those little funny built, rebuilt kind of things there, because actually the Great Wall hadn't been one cohesive thing all the time, right? It's a series of different defensive walls, but during the Ming, it does become one cohesive thing much more. So in sort of rebuilding the sections of the wall that had fallen into disrepair, he also made it more of one sort of particular defensive barrier all across the north. So there they are, the Ming engaged in all of their foreign wars. There's the Great Wall at Badaling, which is north of Beijing, right? Being sort of, this is of course how it looks now after being repaired and rebuilt and renovated frequently. So this was all sort of well and good for making a more sort of garrisoned state, right? It sort of sounds like. more defensive walls, bigger military, less movement of the peasants. But China really hadn't had a garrison state in this sense, at least not to this size. So it was, in some ways, an attempt to return to authentic Chineseness after getting rid of the Mongols. But in order to do that, they also engaged in practices that were a little funky and not necessarily all that Chinese in some ways. One of the early Ming rulers after Hongwu was Yongle. So Yongle was totally different in style, right? So Hongwu, the first emperor of the Ming, had, he was an orphan, he didn't know who his parents were, he had come up as a rebel, right? He was a resistance fighter, basically. Yongle is not that way. Now, by the time he's around, the Ming Dynasty has been around for, 60 years before he becomes a ruler, and it's more settled. He is going to continue to sort of rule in the name of getting back to that authentic Chineseness. That's going to be a big theme throughout the Ming, but he's no longer as worried about outsiders. Once the Ming have this huge army and they've pushed back the Mongols, they have a lot more breathing room. And Yongle launches a bunch of policies that are really interesting. He moves the capital back to Beijing. Why would you do this? Well, if you're constantly sort of fighting up north, if your capital is further south, you can't communicate with the soldiers as well. It takes longer to get there. Also, the city wasn't really in the center of the empire. If you move the capital to Beijing, it's easier to control the north a little bit because your capital is kind of closer to the center in some ways. In Beijing, he sets about building the Forbidden City. That's what it's called now, right? Basically, in the middle of downtown Beijing, there's this huge, several square mile building or series of building. It's the Imperial Palace. Inside of this palace, it used to be only the emperor and family and government bureaucrats and like servants to the imperial family and all this sort of thing. It was forbidden for regular people to be in there. It was the seat of the Chinese government, but also in some ways, according to the Ming, sort of the universe, right? So at the center of the universe was this palace complex in the center of Beijing. And this is where all the sort of government work came about. This palace complex is huge. It's absolutely enormous. This is one of the entryway buildings just to get you into the palace. There's a huge series of gates and moats and bridges. You'll notice all the roofs are yellow. Yellow was a sort of imperial color. Only the royal family was allowed to have it. The emperor was allowed to have it as the roof color. I wandered around this thing. I mean, you can wander around for like hours and hours. You just get tired. It's so big. Like, there's no way the emperor was ever even in most of these rooms in this building, or in this sort of series of buildings. There were houses for all of the different members of the imperial court, all the different courtesans, the emperor's wife, but also all of his concubines and servants and eunuchs and all of the staff and chefs and, generals that had, offices there and all kinds of stuff. Huge, huge palace complex. And it's going to remain the seat of authority right up until today. Today it's kind of a tourist institution, but it's still seen as the center of sort of previous Chinese imperial government. The Qing used it and stuff. We'll get to that a little bit later. So really just an amazing sort of whole palace complex, right? But there was lots of other stuff going on. One of the things that Yongle did was he set up these explorations. He was not xenophobic. He was not super paranoid about attacks from outside in the way that some of his predecessors had been. And he thought that the Ming Dynasty was basically the biggest and best in the world. and he wanted to find out what was happening. So he commissioned this guy Zheng He to go on explorations and find out what was out there. This guy is super interesting as a sort of world historical figure. Often he comes up in world history textbooks and stuff because they're just like dying to be able to show some of the other explorers in the age of exploration and stuff. So this is, you'll note, 40 or 50 years before Europeans start to travel around the Atlantic world. So the Ming send out these massive explorations of the world's oceans and try to sort of chart the known world and see what's out there. And the captain who's picked to command this fleet is Zheng He. He was, interestingly, from southern China. He had grown up in the Navy and had developed a career. He was a Muslim. He also had been castrated when he was young because he was supposed to grow up to be a eunuch, but that didn't work out. He wasn't admitted to any of the sort of eunuch positions, so instead he was in the Navy. So really funky, really interesting story. He gets sent on all these explorations. He goes on massive trips. Here you can see leaving from Nanjing, right, which was just a bigger port than Beijing, to go out and sort of explore the oceans around China, but also Southeast Asia and India. He goes over to Saudi Arabia. He goes to East Africa. This is a really crazy expanse of the world that he charts out over at least 7 different expeditions. So here's some of them labeled by each different trip he took. So the first trip that was 2 years long, you can see if you follow the red dots, right? So leaving China, down to Southeast Asia, down to Java, over to India and back. But then you can see later trips he goes to Southeast Asia, later trips he goes to India, East Africa. Really incredible series of voyages. And the size and scale of these expeditions are so much bigger than anything Europe did until maybe the 19th century or something. It's absolutely incredible. On his first exploration in 1405, he took 62 ships with almost 28,000 crew members combined on this expedition. These ships were loaded with weapons and trade goods and cash and sent about. They're kind of trade missions, they're kind of military muscle flexing, they're kind of charting the known world, they're sort of about telling everybody how great the Ming Dynasty is. It's really complex. Here is a great graphic to give you a sense of the size and scales of these ships. In the background is the ship Zheng He was on this first exploration. In the foreground is the ship Columbus was on. So you can get a sense of just the radically different size and scale. Europeans just didn't have anything like this. These are really incredible. Here's a model of Zheng He's ship that shows the sails and the sort of complex structure there. Here's a different model, and if you look at it, you'll see something really weird on the deck. In the front of the ship, you'll notice that they're farming. They grew rice on the ship so that they would have food as they went. That's how massive these ships were. They could farm on the deck of the ship. It's really incredible. And these journeys are really funky because they don't have a particular reason. They weren't really going anywhere. Yeah, they're engaging in trade. Yeah, they're flexing their military muscle. Yeah, they're trying to figure out what's out there. But it's not quite like what Europe was doing later, or even what the sort of Islamic world was doing, sort of spreading Islam. They were engaging in these sort of imperial shows of force. One of the weirdest exploits to come out of these journeys was in East Africa. They were given a giraffe by a local ruler that they encountered. they put the giraffe on the ship, and the giraffe made it back to Beijing, where he lived in a zoo for a long time before he died. His bones are still there in Beijing in a museum. And here's a scroll depicting that. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, imagine you're sailing from China, you've been sailing for a year, you get to East Africa, you pick up this giraffe, and you're like, oh yeah, we'll throw this on the ship, we'll take it back to Beijing, no worries. So these journeys are really incredible. A lot's been written about them. A central part of the sort of early Ming. So I don't want to give you too much on the Ming right now. I just wanted to talk about it, the early sort of formation of the dynasty, getting rid of the Yuan. And then next time we'll talk about the Ming in the context of sort of the early modern world. But for now, let's switch over to Japan and talk about, in the 10th and 11th centuries, what starts to happen there in terms of the political situation and how that drives a new sort of social class, the sort of warrior class, towards the leadership of the state, and what sort of social and cultural changes come with that. So we already looked at the Heian period a little bit. We talked about these new forms of literature and this very, very elite class that lived in the cities. If you read the Pillow Book, or if you've read The Tale of Genji or anything like that, you know about some of these sorts of things. The elite world was just so separate from the peasants and from the regular Japanese folks. And we looked at the way they made their money was they had these huge estates out in the countryside that were massive sort of farming villas and territories where they would have some slave labor, lots of peasants, and basically 50% of everything that was made on the land was scooped up as a sort of tax and given to these elites, which allowed them to live this really, really high, crazy material culture back in the cities. But this also caused a big separation. The Heian elite were so separate from the working folks, from the peasants, from their lands. They didn't actually run the estates. The estates themselves were run by these sort of on-site landlords that were typically warriors. So basically, after about 800, we saw there was no conscript army, right? We saw that the Japanese kind of did away with that. So things like fighting the emishi or policing in the cities or controlling what happens on the estates or settling disputes out there was left up to the local provinces. So out in the provinces, if you weren't like the high elite, if you were like the middling elite, you were the sort of on-site landlords that took care of things, that made sure that the taxes were paid, that everything went smoothly, that handled any kind of criminal matters, that defended from other provinces or the emishi or something like that, or pirates, these sorts of things. And primarily, these people started to transform into a form of mounted archers. So you could afford horses, you could afford some leisure time to learn how to become quite a good archer. And this leads to what gets called the way of the bow and horse, which is the earliest sort of samurai culture, let's say. Some people call them samurai, some people call them bushi at this point. Bushi is just a more general word for warrior. And the way these people fought, you might compare it to like knights in Europe or something in the sort of glorified version. If there were disputes between these sort of middle elite families, not the people who lived the most sort of high fashion and stuff in the cities, but the ones who actually lived out in the provinces, you would solve these disputes in sort of single mounted combat. So, oh yeah, here's some more Heian elites, right, doing their thing. But here's some of those elites that lived out in the country, right? So all of these different provinces have these elites. They're kind of in conflict. Remember, things are really decentralized, right? So these mounted warriors had a sort of legacy of um, soldiers from the state or from the provinces. Many of them had a sort of family legacy of fighting the Amishi. That's these guys. Um, and the Amishi were known for being good mounted archers, for using curved swords, all this sort of stuff. So after fighting these people for 100 years, this new sort of developing class, this warrior elite that lived in the countrysides, had developed those same things. They rode horses, they were good mounted archers, they started using curved swords. And they started to develop this sort of separate, macho is not quite the right word, but sort of separate warrior-based culture. It's not what you're thinking of yet when you're thinking of samurai. And if you're thinking about like honor and stuff, don't worry about that. That's not a thing in the same way yet. Okay, so of these two sort of different there's all different provincial groups, but there's two big families or big clans that develop the most sort of warrior capabilities. They have large standing armies, and they have a number of these sort of mounted archers, which are the main sort of elite soldiers. These are not like foot soldiers and stuff like that. They're specially trained, specially equipped. They're the sort of vanguard of military units. So the two families that sort of have the most of these are the Taira and Minamoto. And they provide these soldiers to other areas. They protect the capital. They, interact with the imperial family, all this sort of stuff. So as these warriors are developing, as the sort of military class is developing, they're also the ones that are running those country estates because the real owners, the real elite, are in the city doing fun stuff. The warriors are the ones that are on-site landlords. While they're doing that, they're gaining knowledge about how the economy works. They're gaining political skills. They're learning that you have to marry into prominent families, but they're also learning about how to repress the basic people. When the people don't want to pay taxes, you got to go beat them up. You got to burn their houses down. You got to scare them into paying taxes. If the people try to rebel, you have to put down those rebellions. So the early samurai, one historian anyway, writes about how the early samurai, their biggest weapon was fire, actually. Because if the peasants were getting too uppity, they would just burn one of the peasants' houses to sort of scare them back into submission. So this was sort of a developing class of necessity because they weren't the elite that could just afford to not work. They were working. They were soldiers. They were police. They were landlords. And that sort of is the rise of the warrior. That's where they're coming from, right? Here's a depiction of one of these warriors in mounted combat. So if you were a soldier, just like today, everything is made for right-handed people. So the way you shot your bow, the way you used your sword, you had to be right-handed. So this had a particular effect on combat. If you're a mounted archer, it means that you're shooting with your right hand, right? So you have to hold the bow in your left hand. That means that, here, I'll make it, okay. So with your left hand is where you aim at stuff. So if you're on a horse and you're trying to shoot at somebody else, you need to be sure those people are on your left. So part of the game with mounted combat was making sure that you were able to use your horse really effectively to duck and dive and get the person on your left. Because as soon as you could get your enemy to your left, you could shoot them, right? Much more easily. So we'll see some more of that sort of stuff. And here's a depiction of some of these sort of warrior groups mixed. You can see the people that are on horses and some of the more sort of infantry folks that are there without horses. but a developing sort of warrior class that was something different that we haven't really seen yet. There you go. There's a good picture of some of these early Bushi. Okay. So the Bushi are really going to come into their own when there's a sort of political conflict back in the capital that calls on them. So the first major event is the Genpei War. So you can see it lasts for about 5 years. It's really complicated. There's a bunch of little moving pieces. But basically, by this point, there were the emperors and retired emperors. So emperors tended to retire after a stretch, but they weren't done with political power. So you would have whoever was the current emperor, but you might also have 2 or 3 other emperors who were retired and still sort of wanted control. So there were often problems. So in 1156, there was the emperor Go Shirakawa. He was supported by the Taira clan. Then there were some of the retired emperors, and they were supported by the Minamoto clan. So remember, these were the 2 biggest sort of warrior factions, and they're supporting different political groups for who's going to sort of run the state. So Go Shirakawa was the emperor, and he is going to essentially fight the retired emperors and win. But he doesn't actually do the fighting. He has this family, the Taira family, fight for him. So the Taira family wins this war between the Taira and the Minamoto, who are representing the emperor and the retired emperors. When the Taira family wins, the emperor wins. But in reality, the Taira family wins, right? Because they were the ones actually doing the fighting. The emperor gets to, Go Shirakawa continues to be in charge politically, sort of, but really it's the Taira clan. They're the ones that won the war, they're the ones that backed the emperor, they're the ones that really give all the military support. So this is very upsetting for the Minamoto family. They lost. The head of their family was murdered, but his 2 sons were not killed. Instead, they were sent off to Kamakura, which is kind of the capital further away, into exile. That was a mistake. Sometimes, if you're going to destroy a clan or something, you better make sure you get them all. I'm not sure why you take 2 of the most prominent sons and like exile them for later. But anywho. So it's a few years later, and the Taira clan has become more and more powerful. So powerful, they don't need the emperor anymore. So the Taira family tries to just force out the emperor. So Go Shirakawa, who they had originally protected, right? They try to just force him out. So his son puts out this call to all the daimyo, to all the big families, for help, protect the emperor. So who's going to come to the emperor's aid? It's the Minamoto family. They hate the Taira, right? So the Minamoto are going to come back. In particular, Minamoto Yoritomo. So Yoritomo is one of those 2 sons, right, who was separated and sent out. So in a shocking surprise, Yoritomo is able to raise a huge army of people who don't like the Taira family and want to support the emperor. But this is weird because the Taira only like 30 years earlier had saved the emperor. Anyway, doesn't matter. These things change all the time. So Yoritomo wins. He fields a huge army and he fights the Taira. And in 1185, the Taira's beaten. But the Minamoto family has an idea. It didn't really work out for the Taira, so they want to do something different. Instead, they stay where they are in Kamakura. This is near like modern day Tokyo. It's a little bit south. They don't go to the capital and rule as like the family guardian, the emperor or something. Instead, they're just going to stay in Kamakura and run the politics from there. They basically put the imperial government in a box and put them on the shelf. And the Kamakura family runs the politics of Japan while the emperor sits in the background. Here's a painting depicting one particular scene from the Genpei War. There's a bunch of different battles that happen and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, here you go. Here's Minamoto Yoritomo. So this map might help a little bit. So there's Tokyo, right? You might know where that is. And you can see south of it is Kamakura. And then over far to the west is Kyoto, right? That's the capital where the emperor lived and where the Taira clan had lived and stuff like this. So you can see how far away basically the Minamoto family is going to live. They're going to basically have their government running from a totally different capital. Yeah, that's a depiction of Kamakura as well. So this leads to the Kamakura shogunate. Basically, up until now, when we've looked at the different periods, they've primarily been where the capital is. So this new period, right, Kamakura is about where the capital is going to be, right, because there's the new Kamakura. So the Kamakura capital, the warrior government, is going to be run from a bakufu, which is like a tent government, literally is what it means. So the capital of Japan, of the Japanese state, is still Kyoto. That's where the emperor lives, and that's where the sort of religious and political authority comes from. But the Minamoto clan, who's actually running the government, lives in Kamakura. So it's a little interesting. The emperor is maintained as a sort of front for the legitimate government, but it's all actually run by this militarized family. So the way that this works is in 1192, after the Genpei Wars, Yoritomo has the emperor proclaim him shogun. So you may hear Americans say gun, like shogun. For Japanese, that's really weird. It doesn't sound right. They don't have that sound, the so it's shogun. But anyway, you can say it however you want. So the shogun is like a supreme commander, if you will, of the military forces in Japan. So even though the emperor is kind of in charge, in reality, he's not in charge at all. And the shogun is running the military, they're running the politics, they're running the economy, everything. So the way that they keep everything in check is the Kamakura shogunate pays for all of these different militaries, and they give the warriors a sort of security. They give them income. So just for being part of the warrior class, you get a paycheck, which is pretty nice. You don't get a paycheck, you don't get money, you actually get a certain amount of rice. You get a certain number of bushels of rice, depending on your rank, that then you can use to not only feed yourself and all, but you can use to buy whatever you want and field your own armies or build your own castles or all kinds of stuff. So the capital is in Kyoto. The actual government is running from Kamakura, right? That's where the shogun lives. But that puts them pretty far from Western Japan. So in far Western Japan, the control of the shogunate is weak, right? So that you still have this sort of not centralized government. Here you go. Here is one of these new people under the shogunate. You start to get the samurai. This is where you can look at them and say, these people are samurai, because you now have a totally unique military class of people that are paid just to be the military class. And as we're going to see, this is going to lead to a bunch of problems, but at least at the start, this is a pretty good idea. So when all this is happening, a lot of Japanese Buddhists, in a similar way that Buddhists in China saw this as like the end of the world when the Yuan were there, when the government splits, a lot of Buddhists in Japan see it as like the end of civilization. This is part of that millennial school of thought about the future Buddha, but also just that the sort of rise of the warrior class and a turn away from the emperor and the sort of elite culture in Kyoto appears to elite Buddhists to be really, really problematic. And this leads to a bunch of complex situations. So in the book, for example, they talk about Hojo Masako and her regency, really funky. This sort of complex interplay between the imperial family and Buddhism and this new sort of shogun system led to a bunch of political drama, as you might imagine, having a sort of shadow government and having sort of religious sects competing over who was going to be close to the throne, who was going to be close to political power. One of the other major families, other than the Minamoto clan, was the Hojo family. So remember when there's the long, like little dash over the the vowel in Japanese, it's longer, so it's Hojo. Anyway, the Hojo was another powerful family. Hojo Masako married into the Minamoto clan, and in some ways is sort of seen as like the real sort of behind the scenes power for the second and third shogun during the Kamakura period, and weaves this sort of complex political situation. She becomes a nun, but a Buddhist nun, but she doesn't actually go to a monastery or anything. She kind of stays as a regent. One of the shoguns, the third one who's put in power, is only 18 when he's put in power, so she kind of helps coax him along. And it's another example of where you see these really powerful women making a lot of political decisions behind the scenes that nobody would ever say she was the shogun or anything, but she certainly wielded an awful lot of power. So when you're reading the book, be sure to check out sort of her role, and it's pretty interesting. Yeah. So during the Kamakura period, this is when the Mongols try to invade twice, remember, and we kind of talked about that. I told you I'd tell you more. So here it is, 1274 and 1281, Mongol forces try to invade, once from Korea and once from Nanjing, basically, in China. So both times they're crazy unsuccessful. This is where you get the kamikaze story. If you've heard of like kamikaze pilots or something. So basically the word kami is divine or God, right? Kaze is wind. So the Mongols don't know anything about the ocean or about Japan or the weather or anything like that. They have no experience. And both times when they try to attack, they go during the, well, we call them hurricanes, they call them typhoons, same thing. They go during the typhoon season. And both times this is bad for the Mongols. They lose some ships, they lose direction, they arrive more haggard than they should. So, according to one legend, there's, a Japanese Shinto priest summons the wind to like destroy the Mongols. Nah, that's not really it. They just, the Mongols just attacked at the wrong season because they didn't know when they should be attacking. Also, once the Mongols arrived in Japan, they had to put their people and their horses on boats and go over. They weren't like ready. Meanwhile, the Japanese knew they were coming, and so they were ready. So when the Mongols hit the beach, they were already in big trouble. The Japanese fielded large cavalry units that met the Mongols. They had superior armor, superior firepower, and they were just really overwhelming and just very, very destructive. Here's some Japanese depictions of them fighting the Mongols. So the samurais were able to just sort of mop the floor with these guys. Here's a scroll depicting a samurai warrior against the Mongols. Pretty cool. One of the major sort of things this did was it prevented the plague probably from coming into Japan. So you don't see the plague hit Japan in the same way it does other places. And partially, this is just because they stopped the Mongols from coming in, which turned out to be really, really good for Japan. On the flip side, they raised these really big armies and drew from all the different daimyo, all the different provinces to field all these samurai to fight, but it wasn't really satisfying for them. Sometimes if you get a bunch of soldiers geared up to defend the country or go to war, and the battle's not really satisfying, it leaves them kind of wanting more, thinking they could have done better. So a lot of these soldiers, we're going to see, are not totally satisfied, even though they beat the pants off these Mongols. And that's going to lead to some problems down the road too. Here's a depiction more from the Chinese perspective, I would guess, right, of what happened, because the Mongols here look pretty different. Here's some of the Mongols actually getting attacked in the boats. So the samurais actually like make it to the boats that the Mongols are coming in on. There's a bunch of great scrolls about this, right? Because this was a huge moment for these early samurai that had really only fought each other to be fighting foreign invaders and stuff, right? They didn't really get a chance to do that an awful lot. Here you go. Here's another depiction. Again, this is more from the Mongol side of what they experienced. So the Kamakura shogunate was doing pretty well, but that sort of problem of having an emperor who was the ruler in name of politics in Kyoto versus having the real rulers be the military in Kamakura led to a bunch of little problems. And even within that, there were more problems. Back in Kyoto, there were still the emperors and the retired emperors, and there were sort of branch families. Even though there was one imperial line, there were always questions of who should be the next to be on the throne. So in 1290, the so-called Emperor's Rebellion is going to start. Essentially, two different alternate branches of the imperial family decide to go head-to-head over who's going to be the next group to put an emperor on the throne. This is disputed back and forth until eventually someone tries to do something about it. They come to an agreement that each family will alternate who gets to put an emperor on the throne, which I know sounds a little bit silly in a sense, but it does keep the family from tearing apart. It's all the imperial line, but it's just different branches of the imperial line. Because, of course, over time, there's a number of families that are sort of offshoots, right, from the main imperial branch. So this is going okay for about 40 years, until the Emperor Go-Daigo decides not to switch. He's supposed to alternate and bring in a new emperor, but he says, no, thank you. So when he decides not to switch, he realizes that he's going to need some military help to stay in power. And he calls on and pays for any samurai that will come to help him. So a lot of the smaller samurai families under the Kamakura, their vassals, join up with the emperor. So this is not the Kamakura family, not the shogunate, but subsidiary families. The slightly lower down less elite families. In particular, one of them is Ashikaga Takeuchi. So Takeuchi is going to become important here in a second because he's a great strategic military leader. He's good with the politics. And this leads to a pretty chaotic time because the emperor has refused to switch. Now these different branches of the imperial family are fighting, and they're calling up different samurai groups and paying for them to come and fight for them. So this is throwing the whole shogunate thing into disarray because theoretically, all of these samurai families should be listening to the Kamakura shogunate out of Kamakura. But that's not what's happening. Kamakura, in all of this chaos, ends up getting burned, and the Hojo family, who, remember I just showed you a second ago, they were like the second most important family in the Kamakura shogunate. Their leaders are ordered to commit suicide, essentially, and the Hojo family is going to kind of evaporate. So a few years later, all this sort of craziness is going on. The emperor, Go-Daigo, declares his son the shogun. So he's not going to alternate anymore, and he's going to make his own son the shogun. He's going to mess up this sort of agreement that the different imperial branch families have. When that happens, Ashikaga Takeuchi is going to essentially flip. So the Ashikaga family has been fighting for the emperors. But in this case, the emperor is kind of pushing his luck, putting his son as the new shogun is a bad move. Not only is he not going to be switching out the emperors, what the emperor is trying to do is take power back from the shogun, take power back from the military class. But Ashikaga is part of, the Ashikaga family is part of that military class. Takeuchi himself had hoped to become a shogun. So he is going to rebel. He's going to force the emperor out. He's going to put a new emperor on the throne from one of those other subsidiary branches, and he's going to have that emperor declare himself the new shogun. So the Kamakura era has ended. There's a new family in charge, the Ashikagas. They decide who the next emperor is going to be and have him essentially declare them the new military rulers by 1338. So there he is, by the way, Takeuchi. Here's a close-up on Takeuchi. So this is the beginning of the Muromachi shogunate. So remember, again, we often name these eras by where the capital is. So Muromachi is a district in Kyoto where the Ashikaga family ruled, or hailed from. So this period is when you start to get into a little bit more of the sort of high samurai culture stuff that you find in pop culture and movies and all these sorts of things. It's tricky because that whole idea about honor and code and stuff, clearly it's not true. These people are overthrowing the emperors, they're fighting for rule, they're fighting for the people who pay them the most, they're backstabbing each other. So it's kind of tricky because the whole idea of like samurai honor is a made-up idea, sort of. We'll get to that. It's very odd. This period is really defined by this sort of paradoxical mix of loyalty and treachery. You're supposed to be loyal to the people above you, unless you can be treacherous enough to do something and get away with it, then that in itself is kind of seen as a moral achievement. Economically, this is a great period for Japan. The Muromachi period is relatively, it's not peaceful because these groups are fighting, but Japan's not invaded from outside. There's that same commercial revolution that took place in the Song Dynasty has created a new sort of economic reality in East Asia, and Japan is benefiting from that. There's all kinds of sort of not quite global yet, but Afro-Eurasian trade that Japan is sort of the last stop on. And this comes out in the architecture and the sort of cultural stylings of Japan at this time. So, for example, in right around 1400, you start to see this amazing architecture and new cities, really grand designs. The Japanese reinstitute relationships with the Ming Dynasty. They start importing Chinese coins to use as currency. Before too long, they're going to start selling silver to Japan or to China. So there's a lot of stuff going on. This is the Golden Pavilion that's built in 1397. If you take a Japanese art history class or something, you'll definitely look at the Golden Pavilion. It's considered one of the sort of big cultural achievements of Japan. It's this really incredible pavilion built by the Muromachi family, the Ashikaga family. And inside, there's all these different art that's produced on like screen work. The pavilion itself has that beautiful golden color. The grounds are really amazing. There's a lot of architectural elements that tie into a lot of the stuff Japanese folks were doing at the time, which I'll show you a little bit of in just a second. There's just this sense that Japan culturally is really coming into its own during this time. Even though they're going to start having friendly relationship with China and using Chinese coins and stuff, there's a whole new wave of things that we might start to view as uniquely Japanese that were happening during this time. This is also part of the Golden Pavilion. This aesthetic, these types of buildings, incorporating the water into the landscape, into the building, is a particularly Japanese look, right? But it's not the only sort of cultural development. The Kamakura and Muromachi periods really start this particular Japanese aesthetic that you'll read about this week. A lot of stuff becomes more sort of commonplace that was elite. A lot of things that those elites in Kyoto did are becoming cheap enough or technologically easy enough for the masses. So, for example, you start to see hot baths becoming very common, whether that's from hot springs or heated water. They're still communal. So, for example, your village would have one bath, or your family would have one bath, and you'd fill up the bathtub, and then everybody in the family would use it, like kind of one after the other, starting with the oldest, maybe grandparents, and then at the end the kids could wash off in it. So maybe not the best. But there's also stuff like this where there's sort of these spa resorts sort of places beginning. And we'll see this develop even more in the later Muromachi and into Tokugawa and stuff, where there's sort of the development of hotels and inns and sort of retreats that have things like, hot baths and stuff. You get a lot of local market activity during this period. Cash re-entering the economy and that technology coming from China really does change what people can buy and how they participate in the market. So you start to see busy scenes like this, right? Here's a market day. This is painted on a shoji on one of those screens. So you can see the sort of flourishing nature of the city, right? Also, this is when Zen Buddhism and the sort of culture attached to it really spread across Japan. In part, this is tied to the warrior class. The warrior class finds a lot of the Zen ethos and culture surrounding it to be very soothing. They like the simplicity of it. They like the ideas behind Buddhism of dealing with death and being not attached to things. Of course, this is good for a soldier who might die. at any moment to have a sense of that being okay. But a lot of stuff comes with this. So the Japanese had sent a delegation, right, to China to learn about Buddhism and bring back the Chan style of Buddhism, which becomes Zen in the Japanese language, right? And you're familiar with some of the sort of cultural trappings of this. For example, this is a style of painting that becomes popular around this time. It's very, very minimalist. It's up to you to sort of create the scene or to understand what it means. You're supposed to kind of get lost in the artwork and tune out your thinking mind and be more intuitive and accepting of what it is rather than sort of forcing it to be something, right? The style of rock garden is often associated with Zen temples and monasteries. It's if you're familiar with these, basically there's sand that you rake into patterns, and it's sort of a meditative practice. Anything can be a meditative practice, right, that you do with intention, but you intentionally rake the sand into fun patterns that simulate waves or natural motifs that you like. And the idea is you sort of spend this time doing it, but it's not for any particular point. It's just to slow down, and while you're doing it, you don't necessarily think about a lot of other stuff. You relax into the activity itself with full knowledge that the next time it rains or the next time it's really windy, whatever you're doing will be completely wiped out and need to be done again. But it can never be done again the same way, right? Each time you rake it, it's going to be slightly different. So it sort of highlights the impermanence of our activities, but not in like a scary or creepy way or anything, in a way that should make you think about how actually everything around us is impermanent. And if we sort of embrace that, it actually provides us with an awful lot of security and freedom in the knowledge of that. Also, this is when the tea ceremony and the various methods for drinking tea and the particularly Japanese style and culture around tea develop. It's popular with the warrior class. We're going to see that it's a little bit later that it gets more and more refined to where you get the tea ceremony and tea huts and all these sorts of things. But tea is becoming a popular drink, but it's also becoming a highly stylized drink for the elite samurai classes. Here it is being enjoyed more for like the peasants and the everyday use. Remember, we saw those tea hawkers in China. This is the same sort of thing. It's also popular with monks who drink the tea so they can stay awake and meditate or stay more focused, right? So it has a religious value as well. And you start to see during this time the evolution of a particular Japanese aesthetic. And as you'll read in the text for this week, the article, it has some sort of specifics to it. It's suggestion, irregularity, simplicity, and perishability. So you can see this in Ikebana. Here it is, like flower arranging. A lot of Japanese art and architecture has this sort of asymmetry. It's muted. It's often simple in material or design. It often uses natural things that might go away or hints at perishability. It's a particular Japanese aesthetic that's not necessarily something they got from China or Korea, but developing independently alongside of this sort of mix of the elite Heian culture, plus this new warrior culture, plus the new connections with China, plus the Zen sort of motifs. And you also get during this period No theater developing. So I'll play you a video of a No actor who also makes masks to tell you a little bit about the genre and what it looks like. You can see what it sounds like, what the performances are like. This is the oldest type of Japanese theater that's still around. It's the type that Westerners are usually least comfortable with, but I'll let it sort of speak for itself. So here, I'll play a little video about it. You can check that out, and then I'll talk about it for a second.
ここは新鮮なエリアで、向こうは人間のというエリアこっちはちょっと神のエリアですかね。でここへ来ることによって私はピュアというか神の入り口に入ることができる。私の名前は宇高道重です。能楽師であり能面作家です。能楽の能は能力の能、アビリティとかその能力を楽しむという意味になります。昔は猿楽、一番古くは干支の猿関係で、神さんとの関係が非常に深かった。演者は必ず仮面、能面という仮面を使うこと、そして過去世の出来事を今蘇らせるということ、すなわち能面をつけた主人公は現代の人ではなくて亡霊、幽霊を扱うという。観客がその演者を仮面をなしで見たときに、その人の顔の表情が見えてしまうと感じるものが薄くなってしまう。そこから深く入っていけない。仮面だとどこまでも深く入っていける。室町時代、猿楽が、発展していった頃は、猿楽の小さな座グループがありました。そこのグループでは、その太夫といわれるメインアクトがその自分の作った曲にふさわしい能面を自分で考えていました。時々演者で能面を作る人が、いつの時代もいました。今は私だけです。その理由はやっぱり自分の演じる能でどうしてもこの表現が、必要だ。その表現を必要な能面を自分で作らないと、他の人が作った能面では不満足と。今回の東雲のはリハーサルはありませんので、いきなり、本番ですからかなりクオリティの高いものをすでに作っていないとできません。やっぱりこの、考えて能を舞う、例えば考えるというのは次の歌う言葉は何だったとか、次はこんな風に舞おうということを本番で本当の舞台でまだ考えてやっているようでは、それはダメで です。もっと何も考えなくてもそれが自然に出てくる、そういうレベルに達した時にキラッと光る瞬間に偶然性というか、キラッと光る素晴らしいフレッシュな光、それが本当の脳の美しいところです。いつもだいたい月に1回は必ず、行ってますし、お能を無事に終わりましたという報告はしますし、次々にこの舞台があります。能だけではなく、お茶、お花、あるいは武道も含めて、そして縮小してやがては博物館のようなことになってしまうと、誠に申し訳ないしもったいないと思います。伝統芸能を守ろうという運動を一つの大きなウェーブにして広めていかないと、もう日本は経済を生むだけのロボットの国になってしまう。続いてきたということは意味があるということに他なりませんので、これからも伝承していかないといけないという責任を感じます。
So pretty interesting, tons of stuff going on there. We're going to see some more Japanese theater coming up. Basically, the actor doesn't necessarily have any lines or speak. There's a chorus that's singing. They wear the masks. You've probably seen this aesthetic most likely in something like Zelda, right? Those video games use those masks and that sort of aesthetic for sure. Anyway, tons of new art and culture during this period that develops that's still around. As he says, it must have some kind of meaning because it's still here. So, on the political side and the military side, as the Muromachi period continues, the sort of central government breaks down. We've already seen that the imperial family doesn't really have any control. It's the shogun and the sort of samurai families that are running the show now. So the big samurai families come to be called daimyo. And these are families that consolidate territory through marriage, through alliance, through money. They tend to have lots and lots of territory, lots and lots of peasants, slaves, soldiers. They have heavily fortified castle towns. Oh yeah, there you go. That's the two swords, right? You've probably seen. Here you go. Here's some of them. This sort of samurai class that's emerged, right? I was going to show you one of the castles, but maybe I don't have it for a second. Anyway, these this sort of new samurai class, they're the only ones that are allowed to carry swords. That's coming, but their main weapon is still the bow and the horse, right? That's still the main sort of driver of the samurai. The samurai sword is the main thing, is not coming for quite some time. If you're an elite samurai, your number one weapon is the bow. So these daimyo consolidate into these big castles. I'm sure I got a picture of a castle coming up in a second that I'll show you. And they start to compete with one another over resources, over who the family will marry, over wealth, and who ultimately is in control of Japan. Some people are very happy to sit and just control their big family and their big territory. Others really want to control what's left of the sort of central government that's ostensibly being run by the emperors, but not really. So there's a lot of infighting over who that's going to be, who's closest to the emperor, who's going to be the shogun, all these sorts of things. So the Onin Wars take place near the end of Muromachi. The two main families that are fighting in Kyoto are basically struggling and slugging it out on the streets, literally building to building, attacking each other like downtown in the city. And the shogun and the emperor don't really do anything to stop it. They can't. So you get these mad scenes where there's, Kyoto, it's the capital, it's sophisticated, it's where all the elite are, it's the money, it's the market town. There's all this great stuff, and then one day there'll just be 100 samurai on the street killing each other. And then nothing for a couple of weeks, and then the same thing, and over and over. So for about 10 years, you have this sort of crazy situation. And in the process, Kyoto gets pretty beat up. Some buildings get burned, some Buddhist temples get trashed. Some of those elite families, their homes get broken up. So Kyoto is sort of losing some of its appeal. And when this is happening, a lot of the really rich elites that are in Kyoto get tired of it. They don't like looking out their window, as it were, and seeing samurai fighting over whose family is more important, or who's going to be closest to the emperor, or maybe who's going to be the next shogun or whatever. And it concerns them that they might get caught up in that, or their property, or whatever. So a lot of the big houses, a lot of the daimyo, leave to go back to their country estates. And these are generational estates that their family may have had for 10, 20 generations. But they might have never even seen it, because they grow up in the city, right, in these elite compounds in the city. So while this is happening, there's effectively no central government. Yeah, here's a picture. Here's a scene from the Onin Wars, from those different Japanese families fighting each other out in Kyoto. There's the castle finally. Okay, so this is like the most majestic one, and actually it's kind of built late in the sort of pre-modern period. But anyway, this is an example of the sort of grand castle that one of these daimyo might have. So the daimyo, by the sort of middle of Muromachi, you have maybe 200 or 300. These are really big, really wealthy families that control their own sort of little mini provinces. A lot of the elites from Kyoto have moved back to home. That's why you need these really elaborate palaces and castles back home. They have some slaves, some peasants, lots of soldiers, and they're all sort of vying to shore up their own control, right? And during this period is when the samurai class goes through the roof in terms of number, because all of these people want large corps of bodyguards, they want a lot of soldiers. Now that they're living back on their estates, they want more control, more protection, more defense. But also, because they're competing for resources, they also want more offensive capabilities should the time be right to attack one of their neighbors. So at the height of Muromachi, maybe 20% of the population is part of this newly developing samurai class. Now what that means is 20% of the population is non-productive class. And I don't mean that soldiers are not good or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I mean is, in an economic sense, the samurai don't work the land. They don't make any food. Also, they don't engage in trade. So you have 20% of the population that just gets a stipend from the government, from their daimyo lords or from the emperor, just for being samurai. So if they don't want to work, they don't have to. It's really problematic because when you have 20% of society not really producing, that means that that other 4/5 has to produce more in order to cover everybody out, basically. So you have this large non-productive class. A lot of them are soldiers, but they basically get paid by their lords just for being samurai, not necessarily for being soldiers, right? It's an inherited class that's attached to your family name. So if you have the right name, if you're born in the right family, you just get a check, or bales of rice, bushels of rice from your lord. Now you are expected to then be loyal to your lord and work for them and go to war should it be needed and stuff like that, which more and more it was. But you can see the problem in the system. Instead of one centralized state, you have 200 or 300 big garrisoned estates that are all kind of running themselves. Some of them even have their own currency and everything. So the sort of centralized government has gone away by the end of this period. And we're going to see that's going to lead to a lot of little issues, and some big issues, actually. So, okay, now we have an idea of what China and Japan looked like at the very sort of cusp of this modern era. Normally, when people talk particularly about European history, 1500 is a really big breaking point, in part because Europeans discover the New World, but because of the changes going on in Europe as well as the result of the Renaissance and all kinds of stuff like that. So typically when people talk about pre-modern and modern, the cutoff is around 1500. So we have a pretty good sense of what China and Japan look like going into that era. Next time we'll talk about the sort of early modern period, what's happening in China and Japan, how these developments are continuing, and what the sort of independent trajectories of both of them look like. So we'll get to that early modern East Asia next time. Also, we'll have the midterm at the end of next week, so we'll kind of talk more about that. I haven't done it online yet, so we'll have to figure out how to do that. I'll talk about it in the announcement, and then we'll talk about it more before it comes up. Meanwhile, email me any questions that you have, and see you in discussions.